Chapter 41. I Can Evolve Everything. A couple of minutes after the horn sounded, lines of monstrosities marched into the yard, coming from different directions. The castle's yard was directly facing the road leading away from the kingdom, although it was not the same direction Northern and the Night Terror had come from or fought the last battle. Before Northern knew it, the yard became filled with dark-furred monsters, his own squad of 100 lost amidst the throng. Northern bit his fingers as he waited on the sideline, several other generals like him, Hellions almost as intimidating as the Night Terror, beginning to appear. For some reason, they stood apart from him. But he didn't care right now. Damn it, Northern. What is wrong with you? Remember, we're supposed to be survivalists, remember? He intentionally bit down hard on his finger, using the pain to jolt himself back to reality. The other generals glanced at him the moment he let out a muffled shriek, trying not to shout. Mr. Fluffy was calmly sitting right beside his leg, staring curiously at the horde of monsters. The poor thing probably having never seen such a scene. Having regained his focus, Northern stared at the generals, then looked at the gathering of monsters and the Night Terror as he made his way to the podium. It's a war, nothing about that will change. What I have to do now is think about how I can raise my chances of survival. He paused, thinking deeply for more than a second. Then he summoned the panels displaying his talents. Copied talents. 1/1. Talent. Advanced cloning. Class. Talent true. Name. Many of 1. Description. I am 1, I am 2, I can be 3, 4 or 5. My personas are limitless and only limited by my imagination. In my hands all objects are more than 1. Talent ability. Self-clone. Attribute. Your soul rank is too low to access this information. Talent progression. 0 to 600. This was the answer. It was staring him right in the face. Northern took a deep breath. He had always wanted to take this step, but because he had to be very economical about spending talent fragments, he had hesitated a lot. 600 was not an easy amount to spare. What made him feel slightly better about the 1,000 fragment mark was the 600 that was there. He felt like losing it would scar his soul. He wanted to reach 1,000 talent fragments as soon as possible and witness what would happen, but he had to consider survival first. He'd have to deal with starting from the beginning. He had no choice. If he upgraded the talent using 600 talent fragments, there was a chance he'd be able to summon more than 1 clone. That should at least give him an edge in this battle. He had observed several things from having 1 clone, such as the muscle experience of the clone being ingrained into him after it returned. This meant if he had 2 clones and they continually fought, apart from receiving talent fragments twice the same amount, he'd be gaining experience and muscle memory that he didn't even work for. It had a nice ring to it. Yes, let's evolve the talent. Northern nodded. Are you sure you want to use 600 talent fragments to evolve talent advanced cloning? Northern didn't hesitate, he nodded affirmatively. 600 talent fragments have been added to talent progression. Talent advanced cloning can be evolved. There are 2 evolution pathways. The path of many. Advanced cloning prioritizes many over 1. Upon further evolution, the number of clones will keep increasing but their sheer power will keep reducing. The path of 1. Advanced cloning prioritizes 1 over many. Upon further evolution, the number of clones will be restricted to only 1, however, sheer power will be built upon that clone alone. Northern had first grinned when he saw the first pathway. It was what he wanted after all. But upon seeing the second pathway, his expression became grim. Many or 1. If I have many, I'd have the power of numbers to back me up while I grow stronger and eventually absorb other talents. But if I invest my all into this 1, and make him way stronger than I am, the former sounded so intriguing that Northern couldn't help but want to go for it. He would be able to focus on growing stronger while having the numbers, but Northern wasn't entirely dumb. It just sounded fancy on the outside, but in the long run, it would come back to bite him. If he judged based on his current situation in this hellish rift, he'd choose numbers, that way he'd be able to guarantee his safety and find a way to escape the realm. It was called multitasking. But what about the future? What would happen when he needed quality too? But they only kept growing in quantity. Would he now have a house full of weak Northerns? It was a difficult decision, but he had to make it either way. Northern removed his hand from his chin and looked down with determination. You have chosen the path of one. Are you sure you want to choose this pathway? What? Trying to make me change my mind now? Yes, I am sure. Seeking access to evolve talent, advanced cloning. Access granted. Talent, advanced cloning, is evolving. Northern suddenly bent and held his stomach. He could feel something hot welling up inside him. It made his pale skin boil and redden. He gripped his tummy tightly and opened his mouth, trying to release whatever was boiling his insides. The pain was intense and heart-wrenching for a moment. Worse even, in a place like this. He needed to avoid screaming, so Northern tried his best to stifle every trace of the scream that threatened to disgrace him. The generals were beginning to look at him with puzzled expressions. Even Mr. Fluffy was tilting his head left and right. But Northern couldn't pay them any mind. He stopped himself from crumbling to one knee and managed to stay on his feet through it all. Then a soothing voice resounded in his ears. You have used 600 talent fragments. Northern at that point felt a great deal of strength leave his body. Talent, advanced cloning, has evolved to singularity. It was then that the heat in his belly began to calm down. He couldn't tell precisely where, but he could tell that something had changed about him. Congratulations. You have succeeded in evolving a talent for the first time. Because a true name is tied to talent and attributes, you have succeeded in evolving a true name for the first time. You have succeeded in evolving an attribute for the first time. Northern couldn't help but stare wide-eyed. What is this? What was going on? This far exceeded his expectations. True name? Even attributes. He had evolved everything. Chapter 42. Warfront, Part 1. Warfront, Part 1. Monsters were simple-minded creatures, far less complex and thoughtful than humans. Northern thought understanding them would be a Herculean task. But he didn't even have to try, and somehow he understood them way better than he thought he would, and his only conclusion was, they are just too simple-minded. Usually, when humans march to war, they always sent scouts first. After the scouts had confirmed the situation, they would then send the infantry who were expendable on the battlefield. Well, put it however, they were the ones who ended up dying the most. Then the generals usually took the backstage, venturing into battle when the tide was critical. It was a strategic move, either to raise the morale of their soldiers or destroy the morale of their enemy with the outlandish power and might of the generals. But the monsters had it way different. They didn't care about all that logic, tactics, or strategies. They just took the bull by its horns. Northern and the rest of the generals marched in front, while the others marched behind them, each squad straight behind their general. Each general also had an assistant, and for Northern, it was the familiar face of the monster he had grown tired of seeing at the prison mine. He worried that the hideous creature would not tear him apart from behind while they were at war, but he was kind of confident that it wouldn't happen. Although the creature was strong, incredibly so. Northern looked left and right. It was a straight array of generals, all of them taking a steady but not slow march to the battlefield. I guess I didn't observe it before because I didn't have the luxury to, but they really have their generals in front. He walked silently for a couple of minutes, watching Mr. Fluffy, who was amazingly able to keep up. Then he turned his mind back to the surprises that made him so confident about this battle. Northern never thought or expected that evolving a talent would cause so much change. He didn't know it meant so much. And now, he couldn't help but think that he had made very good use of his talent copying system. Sparks of excitement shimmered within his blue eyes as he inspected the changes on the panel. Copied talents. 1/1. Talent. Singularity. Class. S. Talent. True. Name. Me, myself, and I. Description. I am the only one, it is me, myself, and I. All others strengthen me. Talent ability. Soul clone. Attributes. You cannot access this information at your soul rank. Talent progression. 0 out of 1000. Apart from the attribute part, which left a bad taste in his mouth. Northern was more than impressed. Losing 600 fragments sure took its toll on him, but it was worth it. Although most of the effect seemed to be locked out because he was a walker. But still, Northern was happy. Perhaps it was the thought of days to come that made him feel so elated about this ability of his. With talent fragments, he could continue to evolve talents however he liked. However, it was a tit-for-tat situation. If he focused on evolving talents, his personal growth would be slow. If he focused on his personal growth alone, his talent growth would be stagnant, and when he ranked up his souls and the limit of talents he could copy increased, he would be forced to pay attention to the newly copied talents. Of course, the only way to make up for all of these was to become a voracious hunter of monsters, and maybe target the ones that would give him more talent fragments, then leverage his time and ability on fighting stronger monsters. Either way, he had to become incredibly strong to get by in the days to come. Northern's eyes looked forward as the landscape seemed to subtly shift to something he had not seen since the past few hours of walking. Compared to the other landscape he was used to, this field was a healthy lush of brown grass that swayed gently beneath the caressing touch of the wind. Opposite them, beneath the darkened sky, a throng of monsters awaited. They were like the previous ones, but different at the same time. They resembled large lizards with lethal claws and razor-sharp spines protruding from their backs. They stood powerfully on four legs and snarled viciously from afar like mad dogs waiting to be unleashed. Suddenly, from behind, a queue of battered monsters began to make their way to the front. Northern gave a slight frown as the slaves lined up in front of them. This is really their culture. It's sort of disgusting. They were reptilian in nature with almost crawling legs, but unlike the lizard-like ones, they stood on two legs. An enormous, intimidating creature made its way to the front. Its frame was bulging with power, 2 pairs of arms, and 2 formidable legs with thick muscles beneath its stony stature. Like the rest of the monsters, this one also had sharp spines protruding all over its back, and crude, large teeth jutting within its maws. They wielded no weapons and were primal to the core. The general spread its claws and let out a deafening roar. The Night Terror, who was already in front of the mass, let out an equally intimidating growl, one that seemed to shake the dark heavens. The collision commenced, and the enemy began to charge at them at a frightening speed. The ground trembled, as did Northern's heart. He stood, suspended in his thoughts, wondering if he would survive this, what his first action should be. He gulped and killed the 1,000 thoughts that ran around his head. Then he let out a slow breath through his mouth, managing to calm himself before he fixed his eyes on the fast-approaching horde. "Swing, just swing," he said internally to himself. As the first group of monsters approached, savagely tearing down the meat shields before them. Northern in that split second finally understood why the meat shields were necessary, although he felt disgusted at himself much later. Because of the 2 seconds it took the enemy to sever the flesh of the monster in front of it. Northern was provided more than enough time to gather himself and lash out with his blade. As the mortal blade swung viciously forward, it easily sliced through the supposedly hard skin of the monster like tofu. Pulling his hand backward, Northern withdrew and lunged the sword forward, easily piercing the monster's abdomen. "You have killed a disaster beast, Razorulf. You have slain a disaster beast, Razorulf." Even as the 2 voices overlapped each other, Northern ignored them and quickly faced the next one. As it lashed out with its legs, he swung his sword over his head, slashing it. He quickly jumped back, gritting his teeth. Damn, that was shallow. The inexperienced and naive Northern did not know that a battlefield was not the kind of place where you took a moment of rest without being alert, especially not when the battle had just begun. From behind, crude claws slashed across his back. Chapter 43, Warfront, Part 2. Within seconds of the collision, the battlefield lay shrouded in a thick fog of dread, the air heavy with the stench of blood. The ground has turned into a nightmarish landscape of mud and gore, trembling beneath the weight of countless monstrous forms locked in a brutal struggle. Amidst the chaos, towering above the rest, 2 distinct creatures clashed with savage ferocity, their roars echoing across the desolate expanse. Razor-sharp claws tore through flesh and bone, leaving a trail of mutilated corpses in their wake. The ground trembled with each thunderous footstep as if the earth itself groaned in agony beneath the onslaught. It had only been a short time, not even a minute, yet so many gruesome sights littered the ground. Bodies fell in great numbers, and the clashes rang viciously through the air. From every side, every angle, monsters ferociously bared their fangs and wielded crude, inhuman swords, hacking and slashing at one another. Northern had never been on a battlefield before. Of course, he was unaware of its cruelty, the urgency that every second, every minute held. And for someone as thoughtful as him, wasting even a second was dire. Before he could react, a voracious monster leaped over him, landing a precise cut on his back. As he belatedly noticed, Northern tried to dodge by running forward, but another monster lunged its claws from below, blocking his path. He had to sacrifice either his front or his back. But there was no time to make a decision. Everything he did had to be instinctual, and for someone like him who had never been on a battlefield, it was a wicked and unfair situation. As Northern rushed forward, he instinctively shot his onyx blade to block the oncoming claw, and a figure appeared behind him, raising a vicious axe over his head. The clash of the figure's axe with the monster reverberated through the air. The figure proved superior in strength, though, tossing off the monster and swinging its axe horizontally, cleanly severing the creature's head. By that time, Northern had plunged his blade into the jaw of the monster he was facing. He turned back, his face contorting into an irritated frown. What the hell? This bastard protected me? His angel of death stared at him indifferently, spinning its axe gruesomely and burying it into the throat of the monster that had appeared behind him while maintaining a dark, indifferent gaze towards Northern. This bastard. Why do I feel like he's challenging me? Northern created an arc with his sword, tearing through the torso of the beast that suddenly threw itself at him. You have killed a disaster beast. Razorulf? You have gained an item? You have slain a disaster beast. Razorulf, you have gained +3 talent fragments. Maybe it's because of the war setting. I can't believe I'm easily killing a disaster beast. Of course, these ones were much weaker than the Black Ruger that he and Shin had fought back in the forest. But being able to defeat a beast-ranked monster was a feat that Northern, as a walker, should not be capable of. However, it couldn't be denied that this was a battlefield, a different environment from a one-on-one battle. The muscle memories of the clone also played a significant role in Northern's growth. Speaking about the clone, Northern's eyes stared ahead with unwavering focus, drops of sweat crawling down his pale skin as he blocked, dodged, and shot forward with struggles. I can't rely on my clone every time. I also need to face this. With a large portion of his talent fragments depleted, Northern's strength had diminished significantly. It was no different from before he became awakened. Although he could move well, thanks to years of ceaseless foundational training with Shin and the clone's recent combat with the Phrygian Walker, he still lacked the swiftness needed to execute his moves with precision and accuracy. Many times, when he faltered, Mr. Fluffy would impede his foe's movement by arrogantly biting their legs with its sharp fangs. Then Northern would cut through the critter, harvesting fragment talents. Northern's heart pounded in his chest as he weaved through the throngs of monstrous adversaries. Each movement was fueled by an instinct for survival, his onyx blade slicing through the air with a desperate grace. The monsters closed in on him from all directions, their snarls and growls reverberating in his ears. He ducked and dodged, narrowly evading a set of razor-sharp claws that swiped at his face. The monster's movements were swift and unpredictable, a chaotic dance of death. Northern slid beneath it, plunged his sword upward, and pierced through its jaw, the dark blade protruding above it. With the passing seconds, fatigue piled up in Northern's muscles. Likewise, surges of adrenaline coursed through his veins, sharpening his senses with every passing minute. He could feel the heat of their breath on his skin, the earthy smell of their sweat mixing with the metallic tang of blood. It was a twisted nightmare, where every step could be his last. Faced with such a horror, Northern's focus was frightening. His eyes did not waver from his enemy, and his strike was void of unnecessary movements. It was straight to the point. He either blocked or took advantage of even the littlest of openings, cleaving through the guts of the monster. His hands were tightly gripping the blade. Each stroke was strenuous and weighed on his muscles, but he couldn't stop. Not once did they stop moving. As he shot forward from a crouch and stabbed the heart of the monster faster than it could reach for a swing, an artistic spray of crimson blood covered both him and the dying beast. He blatantly ignored the two matter-of-fact voices that overlapped each other yet again. As another monster lunged into his field of vision, catching him by surprise, Northern stumbled but managed to hoist a clumsy swing that missed its mark. The monster barreled closer, its crude claws thirsty for blood, and Northern tripped over fallen debris, barely catching his balance before a sharp claw whizzed past his throat. The near miss etched details into his mind, the exact position to hold his sword, how much to turn his torso to put enough force behind the blow. With each passing minute, his movements grew sharper. A beast charged with its jaws open wide. Northern pivoted, steel singing as it sliced through fur and flesh. Red blood sprayed his face, and the red cuts on his pale skin exuded vapor as they closed. The headless monster collapsed, its convulsing mass still snaring Northern's ankles. He hacked ruthlessly at it until its grip loosened. Two more of them bounded forward to take its place. The young warrior was a whirlwind, ducking, dodging, and blade singing as it collided with each scythe-like claw. A misstep sent him reeling, the sweep of nails rending fabric and skin. Blood blossomed across the eternal twilight. Fiery pain drowned his senses. He choked down cries clawing up his throat. There was no time for weakness here. The monsters, smelling fresh blood, moved in for the kill. Northern glared at them through sweat-stung eyes, chest heaving, grip tightening on his sword which was now drenched with blood and gore. Even though it looked like he was cornered, he refused to give in to the temptation of summoning his clone to settle this for him. More so, these monsters must never know he was capable of creating a clone. Most especially Night Terror. Northern grinned at the thought of Night Terror. You'll play a huge role in laying waste to that bastard for me. So no, I'm not going to let him know my hidden card. A familiar dark figure plowed through the melee toward him. Glimpses of a whirling axe and gouts of blood flashed in Northern's periphery vision as his angel of death left behind a path of death with elegant nonchalance. Northern grinned and leaped to action as well, the onyx blade ringing in harmony. He matched the hideous monster's ruthless skill blow for blow, keeping his eyes on the monster's movement and, at the same time, on his enemy. His focus at that point was scary. It was like he was in the zone. Even though he was sweating heavily, a testament to how hard trying to catch up with the monster was, Northern's focus did not shift. It only became more frightening. Chapter 44, Warfront, Part 3. The cacophony of battle surrounded Northern on all sides. The guttural roars of beasts, their dying shrieks, the continuous clangs of talon and steel meeting claw and fang. He moved through the chaos with a single purpose, the blade carving deadly arcs through the air. Survival. With each foe he felled, exhaustion seeped deeper into his muscles, his grip on his sword becoming slick with sweat and gore. But his eyes remained sharp, missing nothing around him even as he traded blows with the monster at his side. The hideous Hellion fought with a feral grace, its massive axe cleaving apart any that dared to approach it. Dark blood spurted around it as it crushed bones and severed limbs. To the unaware eye, it would seem like the true threat on this nightmarish battlefield. Yet Northern knew better. Beneath the monster's brutality lay a cunning intellect, its attacks coming at precise moments to drive back Northern's own enemies. For all its savagery, the beast chose again and again to protect the young warrior from harm. Why did it shadow his steps so loyally? Northern's guess as to the reason for this strange behavior was pretty obvious. A part of him thrilled at the unspoken challenge in its coal-black eyes whenever their gaze met across the slaughter. Perhaps it was trying to test his skill and resolve to push the fledgling warrior even closer to the ragged edge, or maybe it just wanted to protect him since he was its general, or maybe it was doing both. Whichever one it was, Northern did not plan on losing in this game. It would not find him to be easy prey. Northern's focus sharpened to a razor's edge as he refused to yield. His onyx blade sang Death's song alongside the monster's axe, their combined force driving the horde back one bloodied step at a time. Still, the battle dragged on with no end in sight. For each monster that was cut down, two more peeled themselves from the shadows. An eerie aura saturated the air as Northern's lungs burned with each labored breath. His quickened pulse pounded relentlessly in his ears, matched only by the percussion of combat resounding all around. The clash of weapons filled his senses until he perceived nothing else. His universe compressed into a vortex of violence, every ounce of his being devoted to navigating the storm. Time itself lost meaning until he existed wholly in the chaotic present. Nothing mattered but his sword arm and the relentless monsters arrayed against him. This war-imposed crucible had burned away all but Northern's essential core, the warrior's spirit passing from one enemy to the next as his onyx blade carved out ferocious poetry. As the battle raged on, Northern slowly adjusted to the tone of the battlefield. Northern's bitterness began to seep into his every movement, his every strike. It was not something obvious, but a subtle shift in his demeanor, a tightening of his jaw, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He had never asked for this, never sought out the violence and destruction of a battlefield. Yet here he was, forced to fight for his life, to shed blood and endure pain. With each passing minute, Northern's movements grew sharper and more precise along with the frustration that grew inside of him. But even as he fought with a fierce determination, Northern couldn't help but wonder about the nature of the battlefield. Why were these monsters constantly at war with each other? What could have caused it? When will it end? As thousands of questions ran across his mind, Northern moved through the battlefield, his senses bombarded from all sides. The warm splatter of his enemy's blood on his face, the earthy smell of sweat, and the metallic tang of blood. It all became a twisted symphony of horror. But Northern refused to let the chaos overwhelm him, his movements slowly becoming instinctual. There were more moments when Northern stumbled, when his strikes missed their mark, or when he was caught off guard by a monster's attack. But he did not succumb to weakness. He pushed through the pain, the fatigue, and the fear. He fought with every ounce of strength he had, his blade a blur of motion as he cleaved through the guts of his enemies. His angel of death stood by his side, wielding its vicious axe with a feral glee. Northern gritted his teeth as another wave of monstrous beasts flooded the battlefield. No matter how many he and his dark guardian cut down, more continued to crawl out. The repetitive clashes and screams slowly needled their way into Northern's psyche, his bitterness at the ceaseless violence seeping into his bones. He channeled that simmering frustration into the swing of his dark blade, his strikes landing with even greater precision. Yet precision mattered little when faced with an overwhelming, endless tide. Fatigue tugged relentlessly at Northern's limbs even as his chest heaved for air. The sucking mud and gory debris threatened to snare his boots with every step. It would be so easy to slip, to leave an opening for a tooth or claw to tear into his vulnerable flesh. He narrowly twisted away from a swiping claw, the wind of its passing scraping his cheek. The near miss filled him with rage, at his foes, at the injustice of this wicked battlefield that has now been forced upon him, and most bitterly, at his own weakness. His mounting fury erupted with explosive force as Northern lunged forward and severed the offending limb with a savage chop. Dark blood jetted out, splashing across his face, the rich iron tang tainting his tongue. He spat violently, then bared his reddened teeth in a disgusted sneer. Let them send their legions. He would rip through all of them or die trying, leaving their broken bodies piled in his wake. Beside him, his guardian angel snarled approvingly, the axe carving out limbs in brutal harmony to Northern's melody of violence. They continued their desperate push, Northern's sword arm burning with exertion, his breath escaping in pained rasps between blows. Still, no respite came. The horde advanced as though there was no limit to them. How long had he been fighting without stopping? Minutes or hours or days? Time held no meaning anymore, swallowed by the red haze fogging Northern's mind. His vision tunneled until all he saw were enemies to destroy. The repetitive screech of steel pounding against armor and bone became a nightmarish song relentlessly drilling itself into his skull. Hot blood splashed against his skin again and again, slowly transforming him from man to fiend. And still, Northern battled on, that kernel of defiance at his core, refusing to yield, refusing to die quietly. If this endless hell were to be his reality, then he would force the monsters of this realm to pay dearly for every inch of ground. Even if his bones shattered and sinews became frayed, he would fight until his last ragged breath. The monsters might wear him down eventually, but Northern swore to block every fang and claw before the abyss finally claimed his stubborn soul. With a rasping cry, he charged into the gnashing jaws once again, his guardian a monstrous shadow at his side. Chapter 45. Warfront, Part 4. The battlefield was a landscape of horror. The very air, a miasma of dread that oozed into Northern's lungs with every fetid breath he took. Ghostly lights flickered at the edge of his vision, casting an eerie pall over the already nightmarish scene. They swirled through the roiling smoke rising from ravaged earth and burning flesh. The acidic scent flooded his nostrils along with the iron tang of blood that was so thick he could taste it on his tongue. It mingled with the rancid odor of spilled entrails from disemboweled corpses. Deafening screams echoed all around, the wails of dying critters, the blood-curdling roars of monsters, the ceaseless sounds of claws on bone. The ground trembled under the weight of the combatants' falls, thousands to lone feet churning the soil until it turned into sinking mud. It eagerly swallowed up the remnants of the freshly slain monsters. Their spilled blood soaked the thirsty earth with its slick and sticky texture, sticking to Northern's own boots as he struggled for balance on the treacherous terrain. Cadavers and dismembered parts created a ghastly obstacle course, forcing Northern to pick his way with care lest he stumble into the waiting jaws of death. Despite the cloying reek threatening to smother him, Northern looked past his revulsion, attuning his senses to exploit every advantage. The eerie glow outlining his foes granted him a split second's notice to adjust the bite of his blade. The ghastly chorus of screams guided his steps through the roiling chaos. He filtered through the battlefield's overwhelming sensory flood for that life-saving edge. At times, the deathly luminance played tricks on his vision as corpses seemed to lurch and grasp out of the corner of his eye. The pained wails built to a mind-shattering crescendo, sending his heart racing as the never-ending combat narrowed his world down to each breath, each beat, each bloodied monster he cut down. This nightmarish crucible burned hot enough to sear away a weaker man's sanity. But Northern found bitter strength in the forge fire, letting the horror hone his resolve to an unbreakable edge. The battle's atmosphere sharpened his mind to a razor's edge, senses keened for the next attack, muscles coiled to counter. All that mattered now was enduring the gore second by second. A short distance from Northern, an enormous creature's tentacles wound around a desperate lizard-like beast in an inescapable death grip. Cords of mucus-coated muscle crushed its prey slowly, the sickening cracks of splintering bones cutting through its agonized screams. Bones pierced raggedly through matted skin already soaked with coagulating blood. The cephalopod-like monster continued constricting its prey with pitiless glee, even as the prey's limbs dangled gruesomely, held in place by tenuous strips of flesh. Farther on, packs of lycanthropes decimated a battalion that was composed of gaunt, hollow-eyed lizards. Furred bodies blurred with terrifying speed, massive jaws ripping out throats and chunks of meat with equal ferocity. The haunting shrieks of their prey joined the hellish chorus of the other death screams. The faster they ran, the quicker the ravenous horde overtook their ranks, until all lay in oozing pieces amid crimson puddles. Two enormous razorwolf beasts collided dramatically in an avalanche of scythed talons, snapping fangs and lashing tails. Their primitive savagery was breathtaking as they shredded and sliced rusted armor and hide to access the hot lifeblood pulsing just beneath. As one found an advantage in its opponent's unprotected flank, a sinuous neck curved downward, and a reptilian head descended to clamp onto the vulnerable throat. The dying creature emitted a gurgling wail that cut off abruptly in a fountain of arterial spray. The lizard beast drank deeply, spine ridges shivering with bliss. Everywhere Northern darted his gaze, similar scenes of slaughter played out. The sheer ruthlessness of these monsters would make grown men flee in shrieking terror. But amid the chaos, he seemed almost like an avenging dark angel dealing out just punishment. His onyx sword sang as it cleaved through torsos and vertebrae, spilling fountains of ichor. The battle continued to rage on with no end in sight. But surrounded by such overwhelming carnage, Northern felt a thrill at how capable he was in navigating the tempest. Perhaps if he continued perfecting his lethal skills, one day he might dole out the destruction rather than only endure its violence. A thunderous roar reverberated across the battlefield, momentarily drowning out the cacophony of steel and dying screams. Night Terror and the Lizard Monstrosity, both exalted generals of their warring factions, crossed paths amidst the chaos. A wave of anticipatory violence rippled outward as lesser creatures skittered from their path. For baleful red eyes glared with predatory intensity as Night Terror circled on clawed hind legs, seeking an opening in the lizard's formidable defenses. Its furless tail lashed around in anticipation, its barbed tip gouging furrows in the blood-soaked soil. Hot saliva dripped from jaws packed with serrated fangs capable of crushing armor and bone between their razor edges. Stone-like scales rippled as the bipedal lizard circled it in kind, a low hiss emanating from behind rows of shark-like teeth. Though dwarfed by the hulking fur-covered terror, the lizard exuded an aura promising excruciating demise to any foolish enough to attack. Curved black claws clacked together, hungry to disembowel vulnerable organs and strip flesh from bone. A guttural roar shook the air as the two hellions flew at each other in a frenzy of slashing claws, snapping jaws, and brutal force. Muscle and sinew collided as they grappled and shredded, seeking to tear life from hated enemy flesh. Ichor spewed in great arcs, with each bloodied wound as hide and scale were carved through. They broke apart, circling each other again with primal fury burning in their eyes. Night Terror feinted then pounced with viper-like speed, sinking fangs deep into the vulnerable underbelly that was exposed mid-turn. The lizard shrieked in torment, writhing as it tried to dislodge the crushing, flesh-grinding bite behind adamantine teeth. It whipped its body around, bringing the full crushing weight of its spiked tail smashing into Night Terror's flank. Ribs cracked audibly beneath the sledgehammer impact, forcing the brute to relinquish its death grip lest its spine splinter next. They retreated, chests heaving and bodies leaking rivulets of brilliant vital fluids. But this battle was far from over. These were apex warriors at the height of their power, and both had centuries of vicious warfare etched into their souls. A mere exchange of devastating injuries would never force submission. They had scarce seconds to brace themselves against further trauma to their wounds before an explosive movement signaled the next blistering round of attacks. Jaws opened in chilling bellows as they charged again, this clash ringing throughout the battlefield. Chapter 46. Warfront, Part 5. A thunderous roar shook the battlefield as the two monstrous generals collided in a burst of violence. Night Terror and the Lizard Hellion unleash blood-curdling shrieks, drowning out even the cacophony of the surrounding melee. Onlookers scattered as the attack of the generals clashed with the unstoppable force of a volcanic eruption. The earth itself seemed to tremble in terror at the titanic energies barely contained within these bloody avatars of war. As they grappled, veins bulged from their straining necks covered by armor-like hide and scale. Bicep muscles knotted as sinewy arms shoved against each other with enough strength to cleave metals. Showers of sparks erupted any time their claws raked across toughened exterior plates, screeching with the promise of pain to come the moment softer innards were exposed. Beady reptilian eyes bore into four glowing crimson orbs shining with gleeful malice. Fangs dripping with roped drool repeatedly snapped, brushing against scales and patchy fur. But they were unable to find an opening. These fighters knew no gentle sparring, no pulled punches. Every collision signaled a lethal intent to completely beat the other into pulverized bone fragments. Two unstoppable forces channeling the rage of entire armies behind each devastating attack. Neither could surrender without first experiencing the ultimate agony of utter and complete defeat. They broke apart, chests heaving yet looking undaunted. Their disc-flattened pupils narrowed to bestial slits as they circled each other. Their predatory focus locked on the enemy's hide. Chilling bellows raised goosebumps from all within earshot even over the ongoing tumult. There was a split-second pause. Then the combatants hurtled through the air once more. This time Night Terror attacked like a wrecking ball, clamping bone-shearing jaws through the scale and into the muscle at the vulnerable juncture between neck and shoulder. Before the victorious shrieks faded, the lizard retaliated with a cutting slash, opening ribbons of flesh that immediately wept with a glossy fluid. Ruthless brutality became a form of artistry in their bid to dominate and desecrate. Nearby, Northern slipped furtively between the forms of warring monsters who were completely oblivious to his presence. Mesmerized by the sounds of the cataclysmic duel raging somewhere ahead, he crept even closer. There was something he needed to see after all. From the moment he heard their thunderous growl, Northern sprang into action, skillfully losing his guardian angel and finding his way to where the growl came from. Northern flowed between moving mountains of muscles and armor while his questing eyes scanned the distance. Finally, his gaze landed on the epic clash between the generals and widened at the spectacle. Never had he witnessed such raw, unrestrained power given monstrous form. They seemed more like forces of nature than mere physical entities as they grappled for advantage. The overflow of energy almost crackled against Northern's skin even from his distance. He yearned to study their battle dance more closely, to learn the intricacies of combat mastery personified. Checking that no threats lurked in his immediate vicinity, Northern slipped nearer, ducking behind the bulk of lumbering monsters. Between the ongoing chaos and their total absorption in their duel, the generals took no notice of him. At last, the vantage allowed Northern to closely track the ebb and flow of attacks, feints, and counters. He watched raptly even though his own continued survival demanded that he be aware of surrounding foes. A triumphant roar refocused Northern's gaze just as the lizard landed a brutal downward slash with knife-like claws. The unexpected move caught Night Terror off guard, resulting in a lengthy wound from neck to abdomen. Crimson blood flowed as the general staggered back, vital fluids rapidly forming a spreading pool beneath its massive furred feet. Though merely an observer, Northern could not deny a swell of strange protectiveness over the four-eyed warrior who was now at a disadvantage. "You can't die here. You are mine to kill." Without conscious thought, he summoned his clone, visualizing it in existence near the struggling Night Terror. Northern's clone landed solidly between the hulking Night Terror and his advancing lizard adversary, before rushing the latter with an unthinking urgency that was meant to forestall the intended killing blow. The clone's intervention bought precious seconds for the four-eyed general to regain its equilibrium, but also drew the full brunt of the enemy's lethal focus. Night Terror gave Northern's clone a vicious cold glare. At that moment, Northern's eyes widened. No way! The onyx blade clashed deafeningly against crude claws as the two generals at first saw only an obstacle to crush beneath claws and jaws. The clone rolled away to evade slashing talons, springing upright with its dark blade at the ready. Crimson blood coated the cold onyx metal, but no fatal mark had yet tainted it. A sibilant hiss betraying irritation curled from the lizard's fanged maw. This small interloper had proven to be unexpectedly resilient, in contrast to the tissue paper defenses of most small entities. Dark eyes narrowed, recognizing something uncanny in the way the figure moved. Utterly silent save for the ring of steel, which radiated an aura of a whispering shadow. It did not fight like any conventional warm blood. As the lizard circled more warily, Night Terror shook off its pained daze and focused on Northern. At first its hellfire eyes narrowed in suspicion. Few would risk themselves so freely for a monster, especially amidst such a desperate struggle between warring races. The monster probably understood well that what Northern wanted more than anything was also to have a taste of its blood. Night Terror raised its chin and looked away indifferently. The clone did not respond or show any emotion in particular. It couldn't, even if Northern wanted it to. The seasoned fighter just stared expressionlessly, and shifted its gaze as their lizard adversary jumped into a ferocious onslaught. For the first few seconds of engaged battle with the bipedal lizard, Northern's clone struggled while Night Terror stood and watched as it desperately blocked the bone-shattering attacks of the lizard's claws. But as the clone continued holding its own, countering ferocious attacks with determined focus, a glimmer of curiosity flickered across Night Terror's vulpine features. It could see the desperation in its attempt to stay alive. One single mistake and he would die. Night Terror's feral face creased into a puzzled frown on four malicious eyes. Just who or what was this being, and to what end? Even after he had almost died by its hand, he was still desperately fighting to protect. Why? A wholly visceral sense of familiarity teased the edges of Night Terror's consciousness. Monsters were quite easy to fool. A sense of kinship overwhelmed it. Its eyes gleamed even more viciously as the white-haired human desperately warded off the lizard's enormous attacks. Still cradling gushing wounds, Night Terror nevertheless strode forward to reassert its dominance in this duel. Behind the grim-visaged mask, Northern transmitted rapid-fire battle plans and tactical analysis along the Shadow Clone's link even as the clone itself deftly parried all fangs and claws aimed its way. His perception from the clone's point of view felt different. It felt better than the last time. Undoubtedly, this was probably owed to the fact that he upgraded the talent, but with the number of attacks that had slipped past the clone's defense, it should long be a pile of dust by now. But it was still standing with a cold formality. Night Terror initiated a wordless rhythm of slashes and bites serving to drive their opponent back one step. Then another, and another. Meanwhile, Northern observed and calculated, his keen gaze marking the tiniest advantageous openings in the lizard's reptilian facade. The clone lunged forward with uncanny timing, striking weak points and fading away before any retaliation struck home. They chipped steadily at the formidable scales, carving nicks and scratches that soon redoubled to more sizable gashes. Northern instructed the clone as to which ones to target, maximizing blood loss and fatigue. They made the Hellion bleed out until its movements became slow and its eyes took on a dim cast. United by a silent directive, the clone and Night Terror began dismantling their enemy piece by piece. It might not fall easily, but inevitable defeat now seemed assured thanks to their coordinated savagery. Northern keenly focused all his senses on Night Terror's movement, the way he attacked, and its brute ferocity. Blend with the shadows, then hit hard. Repeat until only one remains standing. Northern's focus sharpened. He concentrated through his own eyes and even through his link with the clone. That was not something he could do before, but he didn't have the time to care because he was busy devouring every move and decision on the ever-shifting battlefield. Chapter 47. The Ultimate Price. The lethal dance continued. Northern's clone and the feral Night Terror worked in seamless tandem against their opponent. Between sword slashes and augmenting claw swipes at crucial moments, the disadvantaged lizard began to grow sluggish. Gaping wounds liberally leaked dark ichor while massive chest heaves competed for oxygen to fuel flagging muscles. Yet the ferocious temper still burned in its eyes. The towering enemy knew that to surrender meant obliteration. Its kind was made to fight until the last spark was snuffed out. No gentle slide into darkness. Only the ecstasy of combat until its jaws closed on its dying breath at last. The lizard rushed, heedless and without restraint, accepting its own gruesome end if it meant bringing even one of its adversaries along with it. Enraged death throes shook the blood-slicked ground. The lizard strained desperately as it grappled with Night Terror once more. Scything talons and snapping teeth sought viscera beyond muscles and furs, even as the seemingly inexhaustible clone renewed its assaults from behind. It was a different feel, it was vivid. If before, everything got seared into his muscles after the clone returned, now it was being etched into his soul as he paid attention through their link. Northern's heart gripped with excitement. He longed to fly into the battle himself. It was like there were new moves he'd love to try. Night Terror's monstrous approach had a crude beauty in the way the dark monster overpowered its enemy with sheer power. But when faced with a foe that outdid it in terms of raw strength, Northern had thought that the Terror would at least be wise enough to abandon that reckless battle style and go for something that spoke of skill, and would maneuver the opponent using its vulnerabilities as a large creature. But Night Terror proved worthy of its battle style. Northern didn't even know if the monster knew it had a battle style. After all, This was just his own conclusion as he watched them attack each other with a ferocious intent to shed blood. The Night Terror still used its domineering power of claws and size. It was very missable, but since Northern was paying attention from two perspectives, even though he missed some things through his own eyes, he realized it with the link between him and his clone. Night Terror, even though it was stubbornly committed to its battle style, still handled the battle with an exemplary display of skill. One that did not befit a monster. Even Northern couldn't help but be envious of the monster's thoughtfulness. It was not a technique that just befell someone. This had to be a result of centuries of one's core being forged through endless battles. Instead of a brute, thoughtless attack at the hulking lizard, Night Terror made use of its sheer attack force on only one point to crack its tough stone skin, while Northern's clone made an all-rounder attack. But even in the way the clone moved, it was predetermined by the Terror's steps. It was as if every movement was a path being carved out for the clone to tread freely on. While the monster fought with a vicious instinct, it outlaid paths for Northern's clone to cleanly weave his strikes. And those strikes came to be impactful in delaying the onerous lizard for a second or two, hence providing Night Terror with enough time to deal some damage. Watching this play out, Northern couldn't help but feel so little. Is this bastard a battle genius? Even though it seemed like Night Terror was looking out for the clone in battle, it was simply using the clone to make things easier for itself. But it was very unnoticeable because of the flashy arcs the clone was able to draw thanks to Night Terror's cunning movement. Northern, at this point, understood and knew what it would take to defeat a creature of this caliber. Together they soon overpowered their flagging opponent, but not before Northern's link registered the creature's Herculean efforts. He witnessed the primal defiance raging in its eyes, felt each resisting tendon within his own copy like a bitter song for remembered glory. In some all-too-familiar way, Northern recognized a kindred refusal to yield, no matter the odds. Perhaps they all were chained here on this endless killing field, slave soldiers bound by the ruthless dictates of uncaring powers playing at conquest. It did not matter what kind of monsters both sides were. In the end, a shared fate awaited all of them. Death's patient skeletal hand finally came to collect its due tribute. What was the chosen instrument of demise? The Razorwolf General's strength finally failed as the numerous grievous injuries took their toll. Unable to ward off both Northern's clone and the savage Night Terror, it sank to knees turned gelatinous by trauma and blood loss. Still, it hissed venomous defiance, curving talons gouging furrows in the muddy earth, which was now saturated with its own spilled fluids. Milky inner eyelids blinked rapidly with shock even as outer scales took on a dull appearance. Its adversaries wasted no time, moving in swiftly for the kill. The clone's tenebrous blade licked out, slipping beneath armored chin scales to pierce deeply into the throat. At the same time, Night Terror pounced onto the lizard's back, using pure mass to push it the rest of the way to the ground in a bone-jarring smash. Hideous jaws closed around the vulnerable juncture between head and neck, fangs puncturing easily through gluey meat and gristle. The prone creature thrashed weakly, limbs twitching in death throes. But escape was impossible, pinned beneath the four-eyed monster's bulk as it adjusted its savage bite, worrying and tearing like a hellhound with a rodent. Finally opting for a killing stroke, Night Terror braced huge clawed feet and wrenched its entire body in a sharp twisting motion. A ghastly wet crack rang out as the lizard's spine shattered at the neck, followed instantly by the rending squelch of muscle and sinew separating. With a contemptuous jerk of its massive head, the general flung aside the mutilated piece of its former opponent. Its tongue slipping out to gather the viscous gore clinging to its muzzle, Night Terror straightened and unleashed an ear-splitting victorious cry skyward. Nearby, the indistinct shadow clone waited silently, onyx blade now stained a deeper, hungry black, having fed well this day. Northern gazed out through its eyes, his teeth unconsciously bared. He was so focused on the boorish sight that he had forgotten to steal the last kill. The butchery continued all around despite the Lizard General's defeat. Surrounded by ever-rising mountains of corpses, Northern's dark gaze crept slowly across the battlefield. In the distance, the clone and Night Terror stood apart from each other in grave silence. Northern briefly met the unflinching crimson stare of the relentless monster commander through the link with his clone. It was still unsatisfied, hungry for more violence. The malevolent thirst personified in those feral orbs seemed endless. It wasn't just in the eyes of the terror. He noticed it in the eyes of every monster, both from the kingdom of Red Mine and the unknown opposition. Suddenly, it struck him as being dreadful and weird. It felt like no matter how many slaves were taken, how many were killed, or how many wars were won, this war would never end. No side would ever truly emerge victorious. Not without paying the ultimate price. The Night Terror cast his clone one last gaze. In its burning eyes, there seemed to be a note of approval. It turned away, springing into the ongoing battle to lay waste to the remaining enemy. Northern sighed from where he was, dismissing the clone. Although what happened next, even he did not anticipate it. Chapter 48. No pain, no gain. When pushing a body's physical limits through intense training or battle, the body inevitably rebels against the strain. Muscles would scream in protest, fibers tearing microscopically with each grueling contraction. It was a brutal process that tested the boundaries of endurance. In the case of Northern's clone, a soulless construct beholden to its creator's will, it moved and struck without any corporeal awareness of its own suffering. No lactic acid buildup to dull reflexes. No shuddering spasms racking limbs pushed beyond capacity. It functioned as a cold, mechanical extension of Northern's consciousness. A ruthless weapon devoid of self-preservation instincts. Despite the clone's indifference to sensory input, the biological stresses remained inescapable facts of harsh laws that bound a human's physical body. Each desperate parry, every ferocious slice through scale and bone took a toll far beyond what a normal man could withstand. And now, Northern was the one bearing the sense of all that pain now that the clone was gone. His tendons strained like overstressed cables, threatening to fall apart from the relentless strain and friction. Muscle fibers combusted in microscopic ruptures with each explosive movement, flooding surrounding tissues with scorching metabolic waste. Even his skeletal structure groaned in protest at the battering forces that had radiated from the sword's impacts. After all, it was an exact copy of Northern down to everything that was bound to his soul. Even Northern could tell how inexplicably different it felt when the clone appeared. Its durability increased, and the link felt clearer than ever before. Its response to Northern's mental command was also super fast, and the responsive stimuli Northern got from it was clearer and synchronized to his head faster than before. Everything was better. So it only made sense that the pain he felt as those memories were sculpted into his muscles should be much more painful. Northern's body shook involuntarily as a turmoil of pain coursed through it. He suddenly couldn't move. His whole body was like a mass of stone that was cemented to the ground. Pain tore through his muscles like a mad lightning bolt navigating its way through thousands of storms. Northern let out a guttural cry as he fell to the ground, attracting the attention of a few, including Mr. Fluffy, who was busy dealing ground-level damage to heels and running before clawed feet could flatten him to a stake. The pup ran as fast as it could, skillfully maneuvering its way to Northern. His death guardian, who also heard the same cry, with an increased ferociousness, weaved crude waves of axe attacks, pummeling its foes along the way until it got to where Northern was kneeling. Both monsters stood by Northern as they faced the rest of the horde. Damn it! Damn it! Northern had not expected this. He didn't think that the pain was going to be so severe. It was unlike anything he had ever felt. Before now, he had at least been able to bear it. But this was different. Northern braced his hand on the ground, pushing his whole weight up, but it was to no avail. His body was immovable. Crap. You must have really exhausted yourself trying to match up to Night Terror. Northern stared down with rough lines beneath his eyes. Perspiration formed all over his face as it slowly dripped to the ground, his chest falling high and low at intervals. He was ultimately tired, and it wasn't even his own tiredness. Northern threw his gaze into the dark sky, letting out an odd laughter, oblivious to the ongoing massacre. His body ached so much, tiredness clawed at him from every angle, but his head was booming with an immense amount of information. It included the memories of his clone's muscles and the amount of information he was able to sync with his mind through the link and even through what he witnessed with his own eyes. Everything blended perfectly together. Right now, Northern just fought an arduous combat with the Night Terror to take down the enemy's general. His vision dimmed as a murky veil descended, fuzzing the edges until the raging battlefield blurred. A hollow ringing grew in his ears, muffling the cacophony of shrieks and steel into a dull, indistinct roar. Crap. I think I'm going to. Strength rapidly drained from Northern's limbs, no longer able to maintain his consciousness. His sword slipped from numb fingers as his knees buckled, unable to support his weight a moment longer. His body slumped gracelessly to the blood-soaked ground, crumpling like a discarded marionette with severed strings. Through the darkening tunnel vision, Northern glimpsed Night Terror spinning in a whirlwind of slaughter. The Terror lashed out in a feral but calm motion, each swipe of claws and fanged maws leaving behind a fresh trail of deep, oozing gashes. Dark vital essences flooded forth in obscene torrents, painting the battlefield in garish streaks as if an artist's morbid canvas. The four-eyed monster seemed an unstoppable cyclone of annihilation amid the horde, shredding through matted fur and rigid scale with pitiless ease. Its brutality was at once horrific yet perversely breathtaking to witness, a terrifying spectacle of nature's purest unleashed fury. As the last of its foes collapsed in rent, mutilated heaps, Night Terror whipped around with uncanny swiftness. Unearthly crimson orbs immediately found Northern's vulnerable form, instantly honing in on the new potential threat with predatory intensity. A deep, feral growl rumbled like approaching thunder as the Terror curled its immense bulk protectively over the fallen human. Saliva-slicked fangs were bared in a snarl, daring any of the insignificant lesser monsters to make one careless move towards its unexplainable charge. Despite sizing up as little more than a meager snack, Night Terror shielded Northern with the same ruthless focus it applied to eviscerating adversaries moments before. Of course, Northern's Death Guardian and Mr. Fluffy also intended to do the same. Night Terror was just faster. It could be seen in the way they paused, with shock written upon their faces. The rest of the battle did not take as much effort as the start. With their general dead, the majority of the lizards were just scrambling away. And the monsters of the Kingdom of Redmine kept themselves busy, slaughtering them. It was a play of viciousness that left a bitter taste in the mouth of anyone who dared to be an onlooker. Blood flowed through bodies, forming streams. The Kingdom of Redmine had lost several soldiers too, but they stood the victor of this battle. For now. Chapter 49. Do you have what it takes? The thunderous sound that came from his surroundings jarred his heart, shaking him awake just as his state of slumber began to near its end. Northern's eyes slowly unfolded, the lines of stress beneath it quite evident. Propping himself up, he supported his whole body with his arms and spent a couple of seconds trying to come back to reality. His muscles still felt a bit sore and tense, but it was bearable. The fact that he could pick himself up was a testament to that. Northern then belatedly looked around with his blue eyes, absorbing every sight that came into view. A slight frown creased his brow as he inquired irritably, "Where the hell am I?" The walls were ashen and antique. Cracks ran across them in several areas, and cobwebs made a nest for themselves at their corners. Tattered and burnt red curtains shielded the interior from the shimmers of light that danced outside. But Northern could still tell a ruckus was going on. The thunderous growls of monsters were almost making his bed vibrate. He slowly crawled off the bed and gently placed his legs down on the concrete floor, looking around once again. This feels odd. Did they bring me somewhere else? Northern stood up and walked towards the broken mirror. This was the first time he had seen himself since coming to the Dark Continent, and he was not very proud of it. He stared in disgust at the boy in the mirror and walked away. What's the deal with looking like a starved freak? Northern stood in the middle of the wide room. Compared to the dungeon he had been staying in, this was bigger is an understatement for real. He thought with a snarl and ran towards the window, consciously dodging the broken pieces of wooden furniture on the floor. He pulled the curtain to the side and looked down. The field before him was awash with the wild roars of several monsters, tearing the flesh of a humongous creature, something that looked like a giant crab. Northern frowned a little bit. He couldn't clearly see what the creature was, but the wild roars, The glee in their eyes as they tore apart its body. The way they grappled at each other. Some even looked like they were having a growling competition. All these activities came together to produce a ground-shaking noise. Northern stared continuously, his expression blank. Then a couple of seconds later, he walked away indifferently. He paused and looked over his shoulder with a distorted look on his face. Sure, party all you want, you bastards. I will be the one to end you. The creaking of the door opposite him at the same moment made him shift in his stance, properly positioning himself to freely lunge forward for a first attack. Northern looked at his legs, even as the entrant made its way inside. Did I just... It was not like he had practiced before or had thought about stances and footwork, but what he exhibited right now felt like he had been so used to it. Northern frowned. Was that how quick the development was? It was frightening to think of, but more exciting because this was happening to him. The thought of getting stronger through a clone made his heart leap with excitement. He shifted his eyes to the familiar monster that came in with a tray. His death guardian bowed its head a little low and went on to place his meal on the table at the foot of his large bed. Northern silently watched the hideous creature walk out on its own, the scenes from the battlefield replaying itself in his head. He had my back. I fought side by side with a monsters. Northern raised his head and softly covered his face with his palms, letting out a heavy sigh as he lowered his head. I don't know what to think anymore. It's like I'm going crazy, like I'm drowning. He looked at the dish on the table, his pale complexion becoming splotchy as he thought of the hell he had been through since entering this hell. He turned in the direction of the window again, his eyes growing distant. Just how am I supposed to close this rift? Closing rifts had technicalities to it. Drifters often made the mistake of thinking that there was a straightforward road to closing down rifts, which was defeating its guardian. While that was an erroneous notion, in order to defeat a rift, one needed to find its core and take it out. Of course, in order to reach its core, you had to pass its guardian. However, locating the core of the rift always proved to be the most daunting of challenges faced in rifts, because drifters would constantly need to search while surviving the onslaught of monsters. In order to be able to find the core of a rift, one needs to pay attention to everything. Since a rift was a disease that placed a chokehold on a dimension and drove it to extinction, the key to finding its core was to know the first point of contact with the rift and the captured dimension. It was easier said than done. It wasn't like the drifters themselves had been there when the rift invaded the dimension they found themselves in. But it was also not like Northern knew all of this, so the thoughts he could put together was that every item received was, in a way, connected to the history of the rift. And this he knew thanks to Shin being a blabbermouth who would never shut up about his endeavors, especially when drunk. On some special occasions, his mother would sit him down and tell him of her adventures. Of course, he was very observant and paid rapt attention when she spoke of the diversities of challenges posed by a rift. However, having not received a formal education about rifts still affected by an extensive distance. If he had been a noble, he would, at the very least, have undergone teachings before getting ready for the academy. Teachings about talents, what happens in the rift, and survival. But Northern knew nothing. He was just a helpless kid thrown into the broad pit of hell. A frown creased the lines on his forehead. It won't stop him. His state would not render him useless. It didn't matter if he didn't know anything. He would find a way to escape from this place. But first, he had to get stronger. A wide grin formed on his face. I have to absorb more and more of those skills. Yes, I have to go to more war, get stronger, strong enough to defeat Night Terror. The glee in his eyes suddenly died down. No. It's not like Night Terror is the guardian of the gate. That's right, there was another monster, more fearsome than Night Terror. If Northern wanted to survive this hell, then he needed to become terrifying enough to decimate the Lord of the Redmine Castle. Chapter 50. Cocky Bastard, Part 1. The next few nights for Northern were pretty bland. First, he made sure he took a lot of rest and ensured that his body was in good condition. While doing that, he also did a few things like inspecting his growth from the war. Northern's eyes were almost ripped from their sockets due to his shock when he found out that his talent fragments went up by 100. I must have fought so many monsters, he thought to himself. Of course, He couldn't wave away his regret of not having the last kill on that Razorwolf general. That would have undoubtedly earned him at least 6 talent fragments. Although saddened by the fact, he quickly raised his spirits with a crazy goal, to make sure he got the last kill on Night Terror. Of course, his mighty general should be worth more. That was Northern's guess anyway. He didn't really know if the danger level of monsters played a role in the amount of talents he received from them. Speaking of Night Terror, Northern had not caught a glimpse of him since he woke up. The wounds he received seemed quite severe. Is he resting? Northern murmured to himself. He heaved a smile, spreading his arms akimbo and closing his eyes. I guess even a terror like him is not invincible. He opened his eyes and glared into the straight distance, grasping his fist. I can do this. Killing Night Terror was not going to be an easy task, but it was doable. He just had to do more of what he did the last time and it was all going to work out. Northern summoned his armor. The scruffy armor weaved itself around his body as he stepped out of his room. Northern's room was a significant change that occurred to him since he came back from the war. At first, he feared that it was temporary, so he tried not to get used to it. Also, since he couldn't communicate with the monsters to find out exactly why he had been out in the new room, it was very frustrating. But it had been a while now, and he was still using the room. No one seemed to have an issue with it, and his dead guardian regularly came to serve him, still always with an indifferent look. Mr. Fluffy also stayed with him, except that it was now getting used to the monsters being around, so it growled less and ate more, slowly growing in size too. After taking the swirling stairs down the tower where he stayed, Northern began tracing a clear path to the yard, passing through the corners of the castle. As always, several monsters were standing in the open area, sparring with each other, their vicious talons striking against their opponent to cleave flesh and crush bones. Northern walked towards the ranks of common monsters. Immediately he reached them, they parted the way for him. Most of them present were members of his own squad, and after what they saw at the waterfront, they showed him absolute respect and unwavering trust. Fighting alongside Night Terror was not something even other generals had done. And from the corners, they glared at Northern, their eyes filled with disapproval. Northern didn't care, nor did he mind. There were bound to be 1 or 2 who didn't roll with him. It was just bothersome that it had to be monsters. When he thought about being a drifter, what he thought he would be doing was fighting and killing them. Not fighting with them and killing for them. It was exhausting every time he thought about it. Although what was more exhausting were the silent days he spent. Maybe because he now felt a little bit stronger, thanks to the experience of his clone, and the talent fragments and items received, he wanted to go back to the battlefield as soon as possible. He also wanted to try these moves that played out in his head. Maybe it was just a fluke, or maybe he had gotten stronger, he wanted to know. He had been keeping it cool, but seeing these monsters brawl with each other just made him want to jump in too. He looked around, setting his gaze on a particular hideous hellion. When he laid his eyes on it, Northern smirked and walked towards it, easily walking through the crowd of monsters as they consciously tried not to block his path. Reaching the muscular creature, Northern craned his neck to look into its horrifying eyes and said with a vibrant glint in his eyes, "Fight me!" The creature lowered its head to look at Northern indifferently for a few seconds. No expression of any sort flickered in his eyes even after the human warrior had spoken his mind. Northern scratched his head due to the awkwardness. I guess it really does not understand. Northern stared absently for a few seconds and suddenly flung his hands toward the center of the arena, pointed to himself and the monster, and then summoned the mortal blade with a wicked grin on his face. If at all the monster did not understand anything, his last 2 actions made things quite clear, especially that grin that was plastered to his face. The monster, for once, contorted its face with irritation. Its expression was literally saying, "I hate that smugness on your face. Wipe it off." Northern grinned even wider as the monster's expression changed for the first time. He turned and majestically marched to the center of the arena. The 2 monsters that were grappling each other immediately stopped and moved back with their heads bowed. Northern gripped the hilt of the mortal blade and headed to the center. Then he turned and awaited his angel of death. The monster slowly approached, its muscles rippling with every thunderous step it took. Its form was massive, almost like night terrors in a way, but battered with scars and burns. Its bipedal strong legs moved forward one after the other until it was standing in front of Northern. It yanked the axe from its back and slammed it on the floor, then rested both hands on its handle. Northern raised a corner of his lips. Cocky Bastard. Chapter 51. Cocky Bastard Part 2. Northern stood 10 meters away from the hideous monster, every sound drowned out by the grave silence around them. The surrounding monsters stared in silence. Even the generals that stood together in the corners showed slight interest, giving occasional side glances. Northern held the mortal blade up, looked at it for a second, then smiled. Looking back at the monster, the onyx blade disintegrated into white sparks. The hideous creature raised its browless eyes with a visible sneer. But Northern simply smiled viciously, and in 2 seconds, another weapon began materializing in his hand. They were the few things he picked up from the war. A long silvery sword was in his right hand, and a dagger was in his left hand. I've never tried using dual weapons, but I've always wanted to. Northern looked at the monster who was still staring at him indifferently. At once, both of them darted towards each other, traversing the distance between them with a blurring speed. Northern's eyes widened as his legs propelled his body to movement. Every move felt easier to execute now than when he used to have loads of thoughts in his head and no experience to pull any of them off. Since his clone had gone through a molding process by engaging in real-time battle with the onerous leader and had now burnt that experience into his own body, Northern's capabilities had increased by leaps and bounds. He made a sharp stop in the middle of swinging the silvery sword at the approaching monster. It was a sneaky move. Anyone would expect that their attacks would at least clash. However, being able to put an abrupt stop to his attack after shooting off at full speed also showed a great deal of control that even the generals marveled at. The hideous monster raised its axe over its head, blocking his swinging sword. Its axe whirled through the air with a bludgeoning force, and by the time it recovered from the attack and was about to strike, Northern was no longer there. He had anticipated the monster's countering strike and pivoted away in the nick of time. His boots scraped the hard earth as he changed directions within a blink. Northern's dagger flashed like liquid silver, deflecting the axe's backswing before it could dig into his exposed side. Gnashing its teeth, the Hellion pressed its advantage, raining down a hailstorm of overhead chops. The weight of each blow caused the ground to tremble. Northern's heart raced as he took on every blow, his every nerve ending coming alive with an odd excitement. Is this how it feels to know what you're doing in a battle? The deafening clang of steel against steel reverberated through the air as his blade and dagger collided with the creature's massive axe. He danced back, his lithe feet carrying him out of reach of the sweeping arc, only for him to dart in again with blinding speed. Blow after blow rained down in a flurry of silver flashes, the dagger in his left hand joining the deadly fray. The monster bellowed, its axe sweeping out in a horizontal arc, but Northern was already moving. He dropped into a crouch, the blade whistling over his head as he leaned forward and lashed out with the dagger. The monster, belatedly noticing the coming dagger, threw its hands up and tried to parry the steel with his axe, but he was sent reeling back a few steps. It stopped, intensely glaring at Northern. "What? Are you unhappy with the fight because you are losing?" Northern retorted, swirling the dagger in his hand with a smug smirk plastered to his face. The monster stared silently for a few seconds, rigid cords of veins forming on its forehead as its mouth formed a downturned grin. Northern braced his legs, raising the long sword in his right hand, with the dagger in his left positioned a little low so it could dive in as support when needed. With a thunderous roar, the hideous monster lunged forward, its movements now infused with an even greater ferocity and strength. The ground shook beneath its weight as it closed the distance between them in a matter of seconds. Northern's eyes narrowed, his smirk fading as he braced himself for the oncoming assault. He shifted his stance, planting his feet firmly on the ground, ready to meet the monster head-on. The air crackled with anticipation as the clash between them became imminent. As the monster swung its massive axe, Northern reacted with lightning-fast reflexes. He parried the blow with his silvery long sword, the clash of metal ringing out in the surrounding silence. Ick! He gritted his teeth with widened eyes as the force of the impact sent shockwaves through his arms. He almost tripped as a result, but he held his ground, supporting his entire body with a quick placement of his leg. That had to come from his clone dealing with the terrifying strikes of the onerous lizard. Northern had instructed it to use its legs as support to withstand the blows for a little more time till Night Terror joined. I don't know if I'm to be happy or terrified seeing myself play out these things. His increase in skill was so fast that it came off as unreal to Northern. Somehow he felt like a cheat. Northern quickly focused his gaze on the foe before him. The monster, undeterred by the unsuccessful strike, unleashed a flurry of attacks, each one more powerful than the last. Northern's dagger became a blur as he deflected the onslaught, his movements precise and calculated. However, the monster's increased strength began to take its toll. Northern's arms strained under the relentless blows, and he could feel his energy waning. Gritting his teeth, Northern grimaced. With a sudden burst of speed, he darted to the side, narrowly avoiding a devastating strike from the monster's axe. Seizing the opportunity, he lunged forward, his long sword and dagger poised to strike. But the monster was one step ahead. It anticipated Northern's move and swiped its massive hand, knocking the weapons out of his grasp. The long sword and dagger clattered to the ground, leaving Northern momentarily defenseless. The monster seized the opportunity and launched a brutal counterattack with a slight grin on its hideous face. Its fists pounded against Northern's body, sending a shockwave of pain through his entire being. He flew through the air and landed with a roll, spitting blood as he tried to get up. He supported his body with his hand and knees for a couple of seconds, as he coughed up a bit more blood. This bastard. That last strike, he didn't hesitate. In fact, it looked like he was smiling. Northern grabbed the sand and spat out blood one last time before looking at the hideous monster who was staring grimly at him. I guess I still have a long way to go, huh? Just you wait. I'll be the one to end you. The monster strolled towards him and stretched its clawed hand. Northern looked at the hand, disgusted, but he didn't really have a choice. He had to embrace these monsters. At least for now. It wasn't like he had expected that he would defeat this death guardian of his. All he had intended to do was test how good he had become, and he had seen it. He was good enough to hold his own against a Hellion-ranked monster. Killing one might be suicidal, but now he knew he could survive should he encounter one. Compared to his first encounter with Night Terror, Northern gritted his teeth, his eyes shimmering with dark flames of ecstasy. Crap. Just thinking about being able to kill Night Terror one day is bringing joy to my very bones. I just want to go to war already. Chapter 52. A Little Discovery. Northern's desire for battle went unfulfilled. It was frustrating to him that just when he needed it the most, the war ceased. Night after night, he would gaze at his profile, unchanged and devoid of any new information. The formless attribute he had acquired seemed nothing more than a mere decoration. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't uncover any additional details about it. To pass the time, he would take leisurely strolls around the area. Judging by the respect the monsters showed him, he could surmise two things. Either they feared him because of his battle alongside Night Terror, or he had achieved a higher rank after returning from the war. However, Northern was certain that it was the latter. There was an overwhelming aura of fear surrounding Night Terror. Anyone who came into contact with it would definitely feel it. But when Northern thought about the Lord of the Castle and how Night Terror bowed before it, he couldn't help but be filled with awe. Just how powerful was the Lord of the Castle? Northern dismissed his profile and prepared himself. A sleeveless black leather armor with pauldrons that had spikes protruding from them weaved itself around his pale body. The vambraces, boots, and armor bore intricate carvings, resembling a dense runic script. He had tried before, but despite his attempts, Northern couldn't decipher the meaning behind the carvings, nor could he glean any useful information from inspecting other items. So far, the armor, dagger, and silver sword were the most impressive items he had acquired from the war. And considering he had managed to kill over 50 monsters, they were not comforting enough, but it wasn't like he had anyone to complain to. These monsters? Who would have imagined that things would turn out like this? He mused as he descended the winding stairs of the tower. Does Shin even know? Judging by the number of clones he has, it seems he naturally chose the path of numbers. Northern's gaze was fixated on the ground as he continued his walk. Or perhaps this pathway was only available to me because of my ability to evolve talents. He pondered, stroking his chin before clasping his hands behind his back. He arrived at the castle's compound and observed the monsters in the vicinity. Each one seemed to be leisurely standing around, until the gate began to creak open. In an instant, they repositioned themselves and turned their attention towards the gate. Northern, taken aback by the sudden movement, followed suit. His eyes widened as an immense creature crawled into his view. It towered over him, a colossal critter with 6 legs that seemed to effortlessly support its massive frame. Its chitinous shell, round and imposing, covered its back, providing a shield of formidable protection. The shell gleamed with a dark sheen, its surface reflecting the ambient light in a mesmerizing dance of gray. 4 sets of compound eyes adorned the creature's head, each pair glistening with an eerie luminescence. The eyes, glowing with an intense, ethereal energy, seemed to hold ancient wisdom and unfathomable secrets. They scanned the surroundings with uncanny precision, as if the beast possessed a profound understanding of everything. The creature moved with a deliberate grace, its 6 legs moving with a sinewy strength that belied its massive size. Each step it took sent tremors through the ground, testifying to its raw power. The chains connecting the wheels to the creature's body clinked softly, the sound echoing through the air like a haunting melody. The wheels themselves, adorned with heaps of red crystals, were a sight to behold. The crystals sparkled with a sinister allure, casting an ominous glow that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Their deep crimson hue evoked a sense of danger and forbidden power. Northern couldn't tear his eyes away from the awe-inspiring spectacle before him. The sheer magnitude of the creature filled him with a mix of trepidation and curiosity. It was as if he stood in the presence of a living embodiment of the supernatural, a being that transcended the boundaries of his previous understanding. The creature was so huge that it almost perfectly fit the top of the 20-meter-wide gate. It came to a halt within the compound, where all the monsters had gathered. As the monsters diligently unloaded the red crystals and disappeared into the chamber, Northern watched in silence, his throat dry and heart pounding. In a matter of minutes, they were gone, leaving Northern alone in the compound. He cast his gaze left and right, realizing that he was now standing by himself. A wry smile curled up the corner of his lips. "This is it," he murmured. This was the break he had been waiting for, perhaps the clue he needed. Suddenly, a second Northern materialized beside him, and they locked eyes. One of them donned a frogmouth helmet that seemed to weave itself onto his head. They exchanged a brief glance before one of them departed, following the path the other monsters had taken, while the other Northern stood resolutely at the center of the compound, patiently awaiting their return. Northern stood alone in the compound, dwarfed by the colossal critter. He craned his neck to look into the eyes of the monster. His eyes grew somber as he tried to understand the look in its eyes. It seems disjointed from everything sad? Even though those eyes shimmered with some level of wisdom that made the creature seem like some ancient sage, Northern couldn't help but perceive a sense of disconnection from it. In a few more minutes, the monsters were back with the carts. They linked it to the chains, and the monster, without being instructed, slowly picked itself up and turned around, its massive form almost occupying the whole castle compound. Then it began to crawl out of the castle compound. Northern watched its form disappear as the gate closed. But his heart palpitated. "I wonder how many talent points killing that thing will fetch me?" Suddenly his eyes widened, as his clone returned. Northern tried to walk but staggered as an enormous pain engulfed his muscles. What is happening?" He wasn't paying attention to the link because he was busy looking at the enormous critter. His clone had engaged in combat with a creature at the depth. Northern rested his hands on his knees and tried to sort through the information in his head. Suddenly, his pupils thinned and he began to quiver at what he found out. Night terrorist? Just at that moment, a wild horn sounded, filling the air with vibrations. Chapter 53. Battle of the Dark Forest, Part 1. Northern was not sure of the meaning of what he saw, but he was sure of what his clone's eyes feasted on. The crystals were being poured into some kind of cocoon, and in those cocoons were monsters that bore a striking resemblance to the general he knew all too well. It was more than them simply bearing a striking resemblance. It was as if they were all the same. Before the clone could get out of the way, a guard attacked him. He survived a few strikes, but even with his level of skill, he was not able to land a blow. But Northern ignored it since he was focused on something else. He paid no attention to the link, and the clone could not equip a weapon without him commanding it. So the clone engaged another Hellion rank with its bare hands. Northern marched wordlessly on. The war he had been itching to have was finally here, but he wasn't feeling so elated about it. Night terrors? More than one night terror? He was having so much trouble with one already, but hundreds of them, or who knew, maybe thousands. It was dark underground. The little he could see was permitted by the crimson glow of the red crystal. But if the red crystals were being used as some sort of material, Northern squinted his eyes. Oman, Krep. Erf! His outburst startled the monster next to him, so he apologized with a gesture, although he didn't really care if it understood him or not. What was on his mind was of far more importance. If what he was thinking was indeed what was happening down there, then he was doomed. Dead. No hope of closing down the rift. Northern shook his head. No, it can't be. That can't be the case? Nah, even hell isn't that wicked. He dismissed the idea and focused on the war in front of them, as they all marched forward. He looked around. Since the last war, he had not set his eyes on night terror. Even now, the terrific Hellion was not following them. Its absence made Northern worried. What caught his eyes made him full of even more worry. He almost stopped in his tracks, but the monsters indifferently walked forward. Stretched before them was a narrow mountain pass, a treacherous path winding its way through the rugged terrain. Towering cliffs loomed on either side, creating a sense of isolation and danger. The air was still and dark, darker than usual. A winding road cut through the pass, its worn surface bearing the marks of countless battles that had transpired in this unforgiving landscape. As the monsters made their way along the road, their presence added a foreboding touch to the scene. Some walked with determination, their feet kicking up clouds of dust with each step. Some lifelessly, as if dreading the horror that was about to befall them again. Many, indifferently, unbothered by what the future held for them. With a pale face, Northern wondered, what the hell is wrong with these bastards? What the crap is this terrain? No one seemed to care except him, and that was very scary. And, lonely, Northern had no choice but to silently follow. Still, he couldn't help but wonder how large were rifts for it to hold such a wide and endless expanse of land. After a few hours of walking, the mountain path was behind them, disappearing into the distance. Tall trees now lined the path, their branches reaching out as if to enclose them as they marched forward. It was as if the path had led them to a place untouched by the passage of time, where nature reigned supreme. The tall trees stood like ancient sentinels, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that filtered the illumination of the gray sky into scattered rays. Shadows danced upon the road, casting an enigmatic cloak over the surroundings. The silence was broken only by the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of a hidden stream. Suddenly, they came to a stop. Northern breathed. It's starting. His heart pounded with anticipation as he gripped the hilt of his sword and got ready. He was expecting the same sequence of things to play out. Maybe Night Terror would arrive in time to declare the match open. He waited, knowing fully well that the enemy was labeled afar in front of them. Suddenly the ground began to shake. Northern's heart quaking with it. It was dark, so it was a bit difficult to see. A loud primal roar suddenly spread throughout the entire dark forest, instilling fear in the hearts of its foes. Northern could see waves of fear as it contorted the faces of his allies. The most bothersome thing was that all of them kept looking at him, including his guardian angel. Northern turned his head left and right. It was the same thing with them all. He frowned. No way. It can't be? With Night Terror's absence, there was only one person here who was worthy of leading them into battle. Northern hadn't thought of it because he had been sure Night Terror was definitely going to come, or maybe he had just been too preoccupied. What he saw underground had thrown him off his rhythm so much that it was hard to focus on anything. Still, the eyes that stayed glued to him beckoned to him for something. Even if he didn't want to do anything, he had to. Being in a position that was looked up to, Northern was compelled to fulfill his duty. Even though they were monsters, it didn't change the fact that he had a responsibility. Is this because I fought alongside their general, or did I really rank up? Northern, gripping his sword tightly, slowly marched to the front, then to the center of the battle. He looked back for a second. No meat shields today? That was reasonable since the path to this war front was unlike any other in its distance and passage. He turned his gaze to the front, fixating it on the figures he could see shrouding themselves in the shadows of the forest. Crap. This battle is going to be a tough one, he muttered. Northern stood silently for a few moments. So I guess I just have to shout. He cleared his throat and, with a deep breath, let out a hoarse scream that pierced through the forest. It was weak compared to their enemies, but it was enough to raise the mighty roars of his allies. The Battle of the Dark Forest began. Chapter 54. Battle of the Dark Forest, Part 2. With ferocious roars, the monsters emerged from the shadows, their forms looming largely and terrifyingly. They were towering creatures with bodies of pure muscle and horns that curled like the flames of a raging fire. Their eyes glowed with a dangerous intensity, and their breath came out in hot, angry gusts. They were a sight to behold, fearsome and awe-inspiring. He could sense the malevolence emanating from them, a palpable aura that sent shivers down his spine. The monsters that emerged before him were unlike anything he had ever faced in this realm. They were larger and more menacing. As the battle began in earnest, Northern found himself face to face with the leader of these formidable creatures. Its fur was a dark, matted black, and its horns gleamed with a deadly sharpness. The creature charged at him with a thunderous cry, its hooves pounding the ground and creating tremors that reverberated through Northern's bones. With a surge of adrenaline, Northern met it head-on. His onyx blade clashed with the creature's massive horn, sending sparks flying into the air. The force of the impact nearly knocked him off his feet, but he stood his ground. Weapons locked in a deadly dance, Northern and the creature circled each other with an intense glare, their movements fluid and precise. He ducked under a wild swing of the creature's battle axe, slashing its flank with all his might. The tenebrous blade bit deep into the creature's flesh, creating a gushing wound. It bellowed in pain and fury, its red eyes burning with a newfound intensity. Then it shot forward with a relentless assault, hooves pounding the ground with a thunderous rhythm. Northern fought back with every ounce of strength he possessed, parrying blow after blow, his sword a blur of steel in the fading light. Time seemed to blur as the battle raged on. Northern fought not only the leader but also other monstrous creatures that joined the fray. However, his death guardian and pet were there supporting him while he fought head-on with the monster general. Each clash of the sword, each swing, and parry brought him closer to the edge of exhaustion. But he held on, battling every strain with an even more ferocious attempt to cut the monster's flesh while thinking to himself with an odd ecstasy that this was how it felt to be in Night Terror's position. The battle seemed interminable, a never-ending cycle of bloodshed and violence. Bodies littered the ground, both friend and foe. Northern's muscles burned, and his breath came in ragged gasps. But still, he pressed on, his determination unyielding. The forest seemed to come alive as the clash of metal reverberated through the air. Steels clashed, claws swiped, and the cries of triumph and pain mingled in a chaotic symphony. Northern himself engaged in a dance of death, his sword swinging with a rookie's desperation but also a glimmer of determination. Their opponents this time were relentless, their attacks fierce and unyielding. Northern parried blow after blow, including that of the general and intruders, his black sword deflecting the onslaught with inherent precision. Randomly, he would strike fiercely at the mobs that came in between him and the general. But for every enemy he struck down, two more seemed to take their place. The battle was a never-ending tide of violence as each swing of the mortal blade met an opposing force that threatened to overwhelm him. In the midst of the chaos, Northern caught glimpses of his allies, their monstrous forms locked in combat. They fought with a primal ferocity, their roars echoing through the forest like thunder. Yet, despite their strength, the enemy seemed to multiply, their numbers seemingly endless. Time blurred as the battle wore on, as minutes stretched into hours. Northern's body ached, his movements growing sluggish, but still he fought on. His sword became an extension of himself, a tool of survival in this savage struggle of life and death. While he and the general slaughtered each other's opponents, miles apart from each other, their eyes met again for a brief moment, and in that instant, Northern felt a surge of adrenaline. Driven by an unspoken challenge, Northern pressed forward, his sword slicing through the air with tired vigor. He focused all his energy, all his skill on the task at hand. Each swing of the onyx blade testified to his growth, his evolution from a rookie walker to a reliable warrior, a puissant sentinel. The battle waged on, its intensity still at full force. Northern fought alongside his monstrous allies, their combined strength a force to be reckoned with. The forest trembled from the clash of the titans. The very air was saturated with the scent of blood and the cries of the wounded. Finally, cutting through the monsters separating them, they collided again. Northern's muscles rippled with intense pain as he struggled to hold his defense against the attack of the muscular monster. Seeing that Northern was thrown off by its attack, it dove in with its head, hooking him with those crude horns and plunging him into the air. Northern flew out of the cacophony, flying through the air and smashing his back against a tree. The monster darted across the distance before he could even get his bearings, grabbed him with its claws, pinned him to the tree, and tightened its grasp on the axe as it raised it higher for a powerful strike. The axe swung towards Northern, cutting the air with a sharp accuracy. However, a resonating clang shook the tree, Northern, and the monster itself as a grotesque critter suddenly appeared in front and deflected the strike with equal power. Northern sighed, breathing heavily. He never thought a day would come when he would be so happy to see his angel of death. The monster straightened its body and glared into the eyes of the muscular creature before it with the head of a bull. Snarling, both dashed towards each other and clashed in a fierce ringing of metal. Their weapons became a blur as they directed continuous strikes at each other, contending strength against strength, might against might. For a while, none of them seemed to surpass each other. Every movement of the general was matched by the Death Angel. Likewise, every movement of the Death Angel was matched by the bullish general. No amount of swift movement was enough. The general just burst through with an immense amount of strength. At times, even their weapons would freeze during vibration due to the power of their attacks. Northern watched the fight unfold while having a moment to himself. This was the difference between him and his clone. He frowned in disgust at himself. Crap! It's not like I have prepared for this or fought wars. Of course, my stamina would still be shit. He sounded like he was making an excuse for himself, but Northern shook away the shame he felt. Instead of sulking, it'd pay to continue this battle somehow. Since no monster was currently looking, they didn't see what happened next. Northern divided himself into two, and one darted off before it could be seen, weaving through the monsters with vicious slashes of an unforgiving onyx blade. Chapter 55. Battle of the Dark Forest, Part 3. The battle raged on with unrelenting ferocity, as the clash of steel and bestial roars echoed through the forest like rolling thunder. You have killed, you have slain you have killed, you have slain you have killed, You have slain a... The two overlapping voices rang distantly in his ears as he brutally moved through crowds of critters that wielded boorish axes and hammers with a frightening thirst for blood. His onyx blade showed no mercy as he also carved through their flesh with lethal precision, unconcerned about the state of his own body. Yet the monsters never stopped coming. For every one of them that was slain, there were even many more that appeared on the battlefield. The general, a towering mass of rippling muscle and curling horns, was a force unto itself. Its battle-axe cleaved through the air with earth-shaking power, matched only by the supernatural speed and durability of Northern's Death Guardian. The two titans grappled in a whirlwind of clashing steel, their combative dance one of incredible violence. Blow after thunderous blow rained down, and shockwaves rippled outward with every impact. Neither gave so much as an inch of ground. Northern's clone fought with every ounce of his being, slashing and tearing through the lesser monstrosities that dared impede his movement, cutting a devastating path through the ranks of their enemies. Time flowed like a blur, but no one was conscious of that. The dark forest was drowned in primal cries and the clangs of steel, thereby drenching the forest even deeper in the blurring flow of time. Bodies were torn asunder, dismembered limbs, and gobbets of flesh scattering in all directions. Somewhere afar, Northern's Death Angel was still locked in a terrifying clash with the general. The real Northern leaned on his onyx blade, trying to catch his breath and move his legs. He gritted his teeth, frowning in frustration as he looked down. His legs wouldn't move no matter how much he urged them to. Northern had, in fact, overlooked the most vital part of his development because he had been so focused on the tremendous amount of growth he received from using the clone in every battle. And that aspect was stamina. He was a spineless, overly cared-for young boy who was barely even 15 years old. Of course, he didn't have the stamina it would take to fight a war of this scale. Other wars had always ended quickly because Night Terror usually went for the general first, killed him, and demoralized his opponent. But now that Night Terror was strangely unavailable and there were more monsters than before, which were also stronger than anyone they had ever faced, Northern was made to see his true limit. He stared for a while, observing every inch of the battlefield through his link with his clone, as it rendered bloody arcs of its sword into the air. Northern looked at his Death Angel, then looked down. His eyes slipped closed as he slumped against the blood-slicked trunk of an ancient tree. He could no longer muster the strength to stand, let alone fight. Distantly, he felt the phantom sensations of his clone being surrounded, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the opponent's numbers. Crap. I'm just going to sleep. Northern's eyes slipped shut as the weariness finally overwhelmed him, the onyx blade slipping from his slack grip as the slumber claimed him. He looked like a crumpled heap amidst the whirlwind of violence swirling all around. Yet, even as he gave into the temptation of sleep, a better version of himself raged on. The clone's onyx blade was a blur of motion, cutting through scale and sinew with lethal force. Each arc of its blade felled another foe in a blossoming spray of ichor. But the relentless tide never lessened. A never-ending surge of fangs, claws, and gnashing jaws hungrily closing in. The clone fought with every fiber of its being, yet it was gradually overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing weight of numbers. Nearby, the crash of the general's axe against Northern's Death Guardian shook the very earth. Their primal duel was one of apocalyptic ferocity, uncaring of any unfortunate enough to be caught in the lethal radius of their exchange. The Death Angel moved with a blurring swiftness that defied its ponderous scale, graceful yet immensely powerful. Its axe was an extension of its body, each lethal arc leaving horrific rents in the general's thick hide. Yet the critter gave as good as it got. Its axe descended in overhead chops of thunderous force, each impact shuddering through the ground like localized earthquakes. Time and again, the sharp edge found chinks in the Death Guardian's defenses, gouging deep into its flanks. Black ichor flowed from the grievous wounds in pulsing streams, puddling at their feet. Still, the Death Warrior fought on, undaunted even as its strength visibly waned. It was an avatar of remorseless destruction created solely for this purpose. The general bellowed its fury, spittle flying as its bestial jaws stretched wide. Its muscles rippled and bunched beneath its matted, horned hide with each earth-shaking swing of its axe. And despite its monstrous might, the Death Angel parried and countered with a cold, dispassionate fatality. Their battle raged on without any signs of cessation, the two figures carving through the surrounding battle with impunity. Lesser monstrosities were slashed apart or trampled underfoot, their bodies adding to the growing pile of mangled corpses. The world seemed to break and blur with each resounding impact, the Death Angel's weapon meeting the cruel edge of the general's axe over and over again in a shower of sparks. On the periphery, Northern's clone battled with equal desperation, slowly succumbing to the endless swarm. Abruptly, an opening presented itself in the general's defenses. Its axe was raised too far into a devastating overhand chop, leaving its flanks terribly exposed. With liquid grace, the Death Guardian flowed around the general's blow and thrust its axe deep into the creature's abdomen. A deafening bellow was torn from the general's throat as it staggered back, crimson ichor gushing out of the catastrophic wound. Its tail lashed about with fury as the axe slipped from its grip, its strength visibly ebbing away. The Death Angel did not relent, pressing its brutal advantage as it closed the gap once more. Metal sheared through flesh and bone with sickening ease, severing the thick column of the general's neck in a fountain of gore. The beast's head tumbled free, bouncing twice before coming to rest amidst the tomb-like ruin of the battlefield. The Death Guardian stood tall, its burning gaze swept the surrounding massacre as the weight of the general's death slowly registered throughout the horde. A wave of terror and confusion rippled through their opponents' ranks as they took in the gruesome sight of their fallen leader. Bestial roars turned to shrill cries of dismay, and quickly, the horde broke. Monstrosities fled in droves, shoving and trampling their own in a mad scramble to escape the Death Angel's reach. Within moments, the forest had fallen eerily silent once more, broken only by the whisperings of the wind. Only then did the Death Guardian turn its baleful gaze towards Northern, who was still battling the remaining stragglers. As if in slow motion, its obsidian form began crumpling inward, buckling under the sheer trauma of its wounds. Its sword slipped from its grasp to clatter onto the loamy soil as the Death Angel folded in on itself. With a groan of protesting metal, it slowly crumpled to its knee. Chapter 56. Fate is wicked, even on monsters too. Suddenly, Northern's eyes opened and his whole body jerked forward. Crap! I slept. Who sleeps on a battlefield? Northern covered his face with the palm of his hand and stood up with shaky legs. He leaned on mortal blade for a few seconds before straightening his back. The visage of the battlefield was not any less cruel than it had been a few minutes, maybe hours ago, before he slept. More bodies and the stench of blood filled both the land and the air. Every nook and cranny of the forest was drenched with the wicked slaughter of both sides of the monsters. It was sickening to see. His stomach churned and almost made him puke, but North swallowed down the disgust and tried to look for the general of his enemy. Then his eyes came to rest on an unpleasant scene. Northern frowned, blue pupils shivering at what they saw. He leaned forward, his face pale. He then hurried forward, scrambling for the ground with each shaky movement of his legs, to the extent that he almost fell. With effort, he managed to arrive at the scene, before the kneeling hideous monster. Northern looked at it, a tight frown contorting his facial features. Nu, 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 nu. Looking behind the fallen Hellion was the lifeless body of the horned muscular creature that had collided with him at the beginning of the battle. Indeed, his Death Angel had managed to defeat the enemy's general, but at the cost of its own life. It was not yet dead, though, it was just weak. But with the gushing blood that spilled from several gashes on its body, it wasn't going to last any more than a few more struggling breaths. And Northern could tell. His hand hesitantly moved, hovering above the monster's shoulder. Northern bit his lips and lowered his hand to touch it. He lowered his head. Never did he think that a dying monster would evoke so much emotion in him. It wasn't to the degree that he would cry, but it still hurt. He didn't know why, but his chest felt clogged, and fear crawled over his skin, like millions of ants, drowning him. He struggled to breathe for a few seconds, then began coughing. His entire surrounding was bathed in blood-soaked battles. Their opponents, this time, were strong. It took more than the effort of one soldier to kill one of them. No one had spare time to look at the falling visage of their comrade. Northern held on to the shoulder of the monster tightly. Its skin felt a bit too rough and hairless, but he didn't care about how it felt to touch a monster right now. He found himself drifting off in the labyrinth of his own thoughts, a maze of uncertainty and introspection that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. The weight of his thoughts bore down heavily upon his shoulders, threatening to drown him in a sea of existential dread. Was this the path he was destined to tread as well? A life consumed by ceaseless conflict, where the only respite that awaited was the cold embrace of death. It was a grim prospect, one that gnawed at the fringes of his consciousness like a relentless predator stalking its prey. The never-ending cycle of violence, the relentless march towards oblivion. What purpose did it all serve? Were the monstrous adversaries he faced and allied with mere robots, programmed for destruction without a shred of empathy or remorse? They were monsters, yes, but were they also slaves to their own instincts, devoid of the capacity for introspection? He pondered these questions, grappling with the unsettling realization that he, too, was teetering on the brink of moral ambiguity. He had always prided himself on his individuality, on his ability to question the status quo. And yet, he could feel the insidious tendrils of conformity creeping into his mind, threatening to extinguish the flickering flame of what should be his purpose. The prospect of battle, once a source of apprehension and trepidation, now stirred something primal within him, a perverse exhilaration at the thought of engaging in mortal combat. What did it matter what cause he fought for? In the end, the truth remained unchanged. He was being relentlessly drawn into the vortex of mindless violence, his humanity slipping away with each passing day. But even as he grappled with this grim reality, he could not deny the allure of victory, the intoxicating rush of adrenaline that accompanied the clash of steel and bodies. It was a seductive siren song, luring him ever closer to the precipice of oblivion. At the very least, he thought he would get stronger, strong enough to be able to close the rift. But reality now intruded upon his reverie, shattering his illusions with cruel efficiency. Even a Tier 1 rift needed more than 4 walkers to be closed down. And here he was, alone in what could be a Tier 4 rift. It was impossible, he realized with a sinking heart. There was no escape from this hellish nightmare, no reprieve from the relentless onslaught of the unknown. Northern closed his eyes tightly as this truth sank deep into his soul.
What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? What do I do?
He yelled out to no one in particular. The fallen Hellion in front of him tried to part its mouth and tried to raise its head but could not. Northern's eyes widened as something struck him belatedly. Wait! If I kill him, I will have the last kill and I can gain talents, right? The moment he had this thought, he felt disgusted with himself for thinking in such a way. Crap! It's just a monster, Northern. Get a grip! He opened his hand, summoning the steel dagger. After a couple of seconds, the dagger appeared in his hand. He rose to his feet, moved closer to his death angel, and hugged it bitterly, saying with a deep frown, "I'm sorry, friend. You fought well." He slipped the dagger into the monster's belly, making sure no other monster could catch a glimpse of it. "You have killed a Hazard Hellion. Weldermorn, you have gained an item. You have slain a Hazard Hellion Weldermorn. You have received +4 talent fragments." For the first time, a kill didn't feel so good. Chapter 57. When madness consumes, Northern stood up, the vigor seeping out of his body as he did so. He tried to walk but faltered in his steps. At that moment, a wounded monster went wild, charging towards his direction. With a cold, indifferent gaze, Northern turned, avoided its obvious attack, and cleanly swiped at it before completely turning. The voice of both Ull and the system sounded so distant. The clangs and cries that bathed the battlefield sounded too foggy. Everything seemed so far away, sort of numb, He closed his eyes and dismissed his clone. Of course, regardless of how he felt, he still had to deal with the pain. But, this time, Northern could not even find the strength to groan as a crude fatigue invaded every tendon in his body. He dropped to his knees, the mortal blade slipping out of his hands. Somehow, the war went on without him. So did the vicious creatures continue their slaughters. Both sides relentlessly carved out flesh, as gore spilled forth in a boorish yet ethereal artistry. The previously peaceful forest was now a plateau of lifeless bodies, heaped upon each other with no space in between. A sickening sight to behold. At the center of it, Northern rested on his sword, trying to breathe with every breath. He took in the cruel scene that was laid out before him. It was slowly tarnishing his soul, tempting to drive him to utter madness, until he became a corrupt slaughterer. Gradually he was losing himself. Regardless of how he felt, despite the emptiness within, he still had to fight. He had to cut through the ranks of monsters. He had to fight harder, faster, and stronger than every other monster. Better than any other general. Northern swung his weapon in an arc upward, creating a frightening gash on the monster's torso. Even though his muscles ached with every movement, he didn't stop moving. His cold eyes did not waver. They were deftly locked onto their prey. At some point, as he approached, the monsters shivered, overwhelmed by the cold tendrils of fear before they were cut down a second later. Northern's presence became that of an empty vessel of destruction, traversing the battlefield and laying to waste every single creature it passed. Maybe if I fight better than others, I would at least be able to keep more people from dying. Northern moved through the chaos with a subconscious determination. His body moved on its own, fueled by a deep-rooted desire to protect and save as many lives as possible. The pain that seared through his muscles and the fatigue that weighed him down became distant sensations, overridden by his unwavering focus. His sword cleaved through the ranks of monsters, each swing precise and lethal. With each strike, he left behind a trail of dismembered limbs and severed heads. The monsters trembled in fear at the sight of him, their once ferocious demeanor reduced to quivering masses. Even the generals of the Kingdom of Red Mines, who had held their ground valiantly until now, found themselves paralyzed with terror. Thanking their stars, they were not his opponent. Northern's face remained blank, devoid of any emotion. His eyes were cold and unwavering, fixated on his target with an intensity that sent shivers down the spines of those who dared to meet his gaze. He moved with a fluidity that defied his exhaustion, the onyx blade dancing in his hands like an extension of his very being. The battlefield around him became a canvas of carnage, bodies piled upon bodies. Northern stood amidst the chaos, his sword resting on his shoulder, his breathing slow and deliberate. Each breath he took seemed to absorb the brutality that surrounded him, threatening to consume his very soul. I have to fight. I can't stop now. I can fight more. He pushed himself harder, faster, and stronger than ever before, determined to keep more lives from being lost, even if they were the lives of monsters. It didn't matter to him at all. He couldn't even tell if he was doing the right thing, the wrong thing, or if he was just running mad. With every swing of his sword, he created a path of devastation, ensuring that no monster escaped his wrath. As the battle crept deeper into the night, the dark clouds hung heavier than before. Northern's movements became a blur of deadly precision as he dispatched his enemies with ruthless efficiency. The monsters that once posed as formidable opponents were no match for his relentless onslaught. His blade found their weak points with unerring accuracy, slashing through their flesh with a sickening ease. As the battle reached its climax, Northern's body finally succumbed to the strain. His vision blurred, and his legs gave out beneath him. With a final swing of his sword, he felled one last monster before collapsing to his knees and onto the ground. The mortal blade also slipped from his grasp, clattering to the blood-soaked ground. The chaotic sounds of the battlefield faded into the background as Northern's consciousness wavered. He had fought with every ounce of his being. He had protected them as much as he could. But even as his physical limit hindered him, Northern worried. Was it enough? Would he be able to save enough monsters from such a cruel fate? In his foolish attempt to prove something wrong about the rift, he was instead falling deeper into its trap. The battle continued to rage on, but Northern was lost to it. His body lay motionless, a testament to the toll that the fight had taken on him. The battlefield was littered with the broken bodies of monsters, evidence of the devastation he had wrought. As the battle drew to a close, Northern's unconscious form was discovered by Mr. Fluffy, who whined repeatedly as it ran around his body and tried to lift him with its muzzle. The little mutt, in fact, was not so little anymore. The other monsters and generals came around and carried his body away from the battlefield, their faces etched with a mixture of admiration and concern. They knew that the odd ally and general had fought with a determination and strength that few could match. And so, Northern's presence lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed his valiant struggle. As he lay in his slumber, Northern's dreams were haunted by the echoes of battle, as several souls cursed and pulled him into a fiery abyss of never-ending darkness. Chapter 58. Lost Boy. Northern lost track of how much time had passed after the death of his favorite monster. Well, second favorite. He found himself succumbing to a strong desire to give up. And it was a feeling that wasn't that hard to succumb to. With the prospect that the wars offered, his growth most importantly, Northern didn't see this as him succumbing to a trap of some sort. He didn't even think this was the doing of the rift. After seeing his death angel die, he began to think deeply about a single thing. What would happen one day if the kingdom of Redmine was not able to defeat its foes? They would be ravaged instead, slaughtered, their blood carpeting the cursed fields of wherever their doom descended on them. The thought of it made chills claw at his spine. I don't want to die. And so Northern began to fight harder. At the first instance, he was consumed by rage. Every part of his body felt numb and uncontrollable. His present limit was tested and a great potential was brought out in the middle of that bloody war in the dark forest. Afterward, Northern suffered the weight of pushing himself to the limit, albeit subconsciously. He couldn't move for days, or rather nights. He lay on the bed in his round room and ate on his bed. The only times he moved were when he needed to use the toilet. The loo in this other dimension was no different from the one in Trael. The design was sort of scary, though. It was like a monster's mouth. He felt like he was putting his dump into the mouth of a monster. Apart from that time, Northern would occasionally carry himself to the side of the window to sit on the table beside it. Many times he just lay there and thought of the future, until he recovered. When he recovered, he didn't take it easy with his body. The need to get stronger now bore down on his soul like a mountain of dread. So that the kingdom of Redmine could stand victorious forever, he began to train. He began to spar with every monster, walking a slow road to being familiar with his own movements. Thanks to the outstanding effect of the link with his clone, he was pretty much extraordinary already. But when he started to put deliberate effort into training, Northern began to see the need to spend more and more hours on it. The movements felt natural. He could pull them off almost by instinct, but he was unable to be versatile with them. And the reason was none other than the fact that he was unfamiliar with them. It was like knowing a thing all your life, such that you can spell it out when asked, but never really thought about that knowledge and got to discover the true meaning behind it. And in discovering that true meaning, it sometimes brought one's understanding to a different level. A level where true potential was being tapped into and versatility was applicable. But Northern was unable to do any of this. Of course, this he got to discover after repeated defeats from all generals. Funnily, even though they defeated him over and over again, they didn't seem to mock him. It looked like they had now accepted him as one of their own, although communication with them still felt a bit off. They could only understand Northern by repeated gestures, and he could only understand them when they repeatedly pointed at whatever it was they were trying to say. It was hard at first, but it later became the norm. Northern could also tell the slight intelligence they had and appreciated their efforts in communicating with him. Before long, he became a part of them and resonated less with his human side. Of course, he didn't resort to lowly mannerisms such as them. As far as sanity went, those were the little he had to hold on to. The cries of monsters on the battlefield became a daily activity. In fact, it seemed like the battles were increasing. Northern lost count of how many battles he had been in. Through all the battles, he was always at the forefront, unyielding in his attempt to flush out victory for the kingdom of Red Mine. Every monster was left at the mercy of his onyx blade. Blood flowed, and fleshes were severed, over and over again, till the memory of it became a blur. At some point, Night Terror returned. But Northern couldn't even count how many wars he had led before the terror came back. More so, it didn't seem the same. It was stronger, fiercer, and bore an aura of rivalry towards Northern. At times it looked like it was trying to catch up to Northern on the battlefield. God damn it! I used to look up to you? Northern would watch it make mistakes and pay no mind to him. Despite suspecting where this strange night terror might be from, he didn't do anything about it. He didn't feel like he needed to. In fact, the memory felt like a dream, an illusion, something he must have cooked up in his head at some point. The wars felt more like reality. The joy of victory was overwhelming. Watching his foes fall to his crude blade was an ecstasy. The awe and honor the monsters reveried him with was reality. The loftiness of his presence amidst them. It felt right. Unaware that, slowly, he was being consumed by a madness. Whatever justification his reasons were for engaging in it, war was war. Bloodshed was bloodshed. And he didn't want this one to end. For every battle won, he looked forward to the challenge of an even stronger horde of monsters. The kingdom of Red Mine practically became impenetrable, but the battles did not stop. And Northern stopped questioning. He grinned and laughed as he severed heads and blood splattered on his face. He licked his lips with flames of madness burning in his blue eyes. There was no more retribution at this point. Northern was deep into the act of war, and was even growing with it, frighteningly. He didn't stop training, getting used to his own movements, and he even began to use his clone less. At one point, the voice of both the system and Ul did not reach him anymore. Maybe he forgot he had a clone. He forgot that he needed to hunt for talent fragments. He forgot he was in a rift. He became a lost boy, and one day he forgot his name too, or that he ever even had one. Chapter 59. A Broken Fella. Northern and the forces of the Kingdom of Red Mines stood shoulder to face off against the monstrous creatures. The clash of metal against scales reverberated through the battlefield, a symphony of violence and chaos. The lizard-like monsters, with their obsidian-black scales and razor-sharp talons, lunged at them with savage fury. Their eyes glowed a malevolent red, reflecting the fires that raged around and within them, despite their cold-blooded nature. Amidst the carnage, Northern fought with unrelenting effort. The mortal blade moved with a rough fluidity and precision, cutting through the enemy ranks like a scythe through wheat. Blood splattered his brown armor, staining it a dark crimson, but he paid no heed to the gore that surrounded him. His face, once marked by determination and hope, now bore a haunted expression. With each swing of his blade, Northern's grip on reality slipped. His mind blurred as he attacked with a mindless abandon. The faces of his comrades faded into a sea of anonymous figures, their voices drowned out by the deafening clash of weapons. He no longer heard the cries of pain or the pleas for mercy. The only sound that reached his ears was the pounding of his own heartbeat, a steady rhythm driving him further into the depths of madness. His memory of cherished moments began to unravel, and fragments of his past slipped through his fingers like grains of sand. Faces he once held dear, his father, his mother, became distorted, unrecognizable. The names that were once etched into his mind vanished, leaving only an empty void in their wake. All that remained was the relentless pursuit of victory, an insatiable hunger for bloodshed. As the battle raged on, Northern found himself at the forefront of the chaos, leading the monstrous creatures from the Kingdom of Red Mines. Meanwhile, they followed him with unwavering loyalty, their savage instincts honed by his relentless drive. The bipedal monsters, towering over their adversaries, struck fear into the hearts of those who dared to oppose them. Northern's presence among them, His transformation from a slave to a harbinger of destruction fueled their own bloodlust. One time, he was human, adopted to a family of two drifters, smart and full of prospect, but now consumed by the madness of war. He no longer recognized the reflection that stared back at him. His eyes, once filled with warmth and compassion, had turned cold and lifeless. The lines etched upon his face were no longer marks of wisdom, but scars of a shattered soul. As the battle drew to a close, the battlefield was littered with the fallen. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of smoke and burning flesh. Northern stood amidst the wreckage, his breath ragged, his body covered in the blood of friends and foes alike. He surveyed the devastation, a hollow emptiness settling in his chest. At that moment, the echoes of battle faded into silence. He had lost himself in the chaos, becoming a mere vessel for destruction. His own identity had been swallowed by the horrors of war, leaving only a shell of the boy he had once been. Underscore, 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 underscore. At night time, another battlefield stretched out before Northern, a vast expanse of desolation and chaos. Muscular monsters, their sinewy bodies rippling with raw power, charged towards him with thunderous footsteps. The ground trembled beneath their weight, sending shockwaves through his bones. He took a deep breath, the scent of freshly turned earth mingling with the metallic tang of sweat and fear. The air crackled with tension, charged with the anticipation of battle. His heart pounded in his chest, a steady rhythm that echoed in his ears. With a battle cry on his lips, Northern surged forward, his tenebrous blade free of sparkles and pitch black like the embrace of darkness. The monsters closed in around him, their growls reverberating through the air. His movements became a blur of steel and fury, his body a symphony of grace and strength. The clash of weapons filled the air, a cacophony of ringing steel and grunts of exertion. Northern's muscles strained and ached as he parried blow after blow, his body becoming a testament to the recent nights of training. Sweat trickled down his brow, stinging his eyes, but he refused to yield. The landscape shifted around him, a kaleidoscope of gray and black. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, scattered with rocks and patches of trampled grass. He could feel the cool breeze against his skin, carrying with it the whispers of fallen leaves and the distant cries of falling monsters. The taste of blood filled his mouth as he struck down one monster after another. His movements became fluid, a dance of death and survival. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity as he fought his way through the horde. The monsters roared in anger and pain, their voices a symphony of primal fury. Their sweat mingled with his own, creating a heady musk that hung in the air. The ground quaked beneath their feet, a testament to the sheer power of their clash. He pressed forward, his body a conduit for his relentless will to protect monsters. The sound of battle faded into a deafening silence. The only noise he could hear were the ragged gasps for air that tore through his bloodied lips. His chest heaved as he glanced around at the mangled bodies and shredded limbs that littered the battlefield, the aftermath of his brutal onslaught. A hollow numbness crept through his veins as he surveyed the carnage. The faces of the slain blurred together into an indistinguishable mass, their hideous expressions frozen in perpetual anguish. As Northern's grip on his obsidian blade loosened, the weight of it threatened to drag him down into the churned earth. A veil of disorientation descended, and the world around him tilted violently. He blinked, his eyes struggling to focus on the sea of lifeless forms strewn before him. Were they his slain brothers in arms, or the felled beasts he had sworn to destroy? The lines had long since blurred. His actions were governed not by code or allegiance but by pure, primal instinct. A choked sound, somewhere between a bitter laugh and a mournful moan, escaped his cracked lips. At that moment he felt utterly detached, a phantom haunting a realm where he no longer belonged. The concept of purpose had become as ambiguous as the path forward. Northern was now simply an instrument of destruction without a firm hand to guide him, a relic from a fading age. As the darkness crept across his vision, His tenuous grasp on reality slipped further. He stared down at his roughened hands, streams of crimson disappearing into the creases of his calloused palms, whose blood stained his skin. He could no longer differentiate the violent acts, could no longer anchor himself amid the nightmares that consumed him. With a guttural roar, Northern cast his onyx blade aside, the sound of it clattering against the packed earth resonating with his fractured mind. His eyes, once filled with conviction, now burned with the embers of madness, a searing, endless oblivion evident in their obsidian depths. As spasms of rage and anguish racked his body, Northern threw his head back and released a scream that tore through the veil of silence. At that moment, the last vestiges of his former self shattered, scattered like dust upon the winds of this blighted land. He had become the harbinger his path had ordained, a scourge born from the depravity of war itself. The broken husk of a man sank to his knees amid the graveyard he had created. Bitter, mirthless laughter spilled from his bloodied lips as he surrendered to the howling chaos that had laid claim to his soul. Chapter 60. Reckoning is here. Northern scanned his surroundings. He wasn't sure what was what anymore as he gazed down at his blood-stained hands. What am I even doing? His mind was foggy and unasked questions pushed him deeper into oblivion. He gazed down from the heap of corpses as his fellow warriors chained what was left of their foes, condemning them to a life of slavery, as minors. He had been like that too once, but had he, though? He had always been a general, a war general, one that fought only for the kingdom of red mines, heralding ruthless victories. Hailed as a hero by the monsters, and yet nothing felt wrong about it. His eyes dimmed, its living sparks disappearing, the blue hue of his pupils dulling and fading. All that was left of him was emptiness. He picked up the onyx blade and jumped down from the heap of corpses, walking behind the column of monsters that hurled away their captives with chains. Mr. Fluffy was behind him, almost reaching his waist. The little mutt was now a vicious gray wolf with eyes that seemed to embody the very entity of darkness. Its canines were slowly curving and growing out of its maw, the rest of its sharp teeth, set in a perfect array. Taking slow and somber steps behind its master, its eyes were lost and tired. They crossed several landscapes, ignoring their crudeness, and soon they arrived at their home, the kingdom of Red Mine. While the monsters jubilated with yet another massive, crab-looking monster, Northern walked up the tower and fell face down on his bed, slowly sinking into the embrace of sweet sleep or death. It was hard to tell the difference between the two states of unconsciousness these days. Sometimes it was like he didn't care. He was losing himself and he didn't seem to care. Or perhaps he had even lost himself. Who knew? The days of war were far from over, and every time, Northern marched forward with no questions asked as he led the army to unmatched victory. His passion for bloodshed only grew worse and nothing was able to satisfy it. Killing seemed to be more and more unsatisfying. Times it was even easy. With each monster that fell under his sword, he gained strength, although he was oblivious to its level. Northern had become far stronger than he had been when he initially entered the rift. Several nights passed, several battles were won, and several souls were extinguished, yet Northern still managed to live through it all, proving himself to be an ultimate killing machine. On a particular night, after a long war with the muscular creatures that happened to be the strongest of the three races of monsters they usually faced, Northern sat on his bed, lost in his thoughts. His eyes seemed glued to the curtains on the window even though he was staring at nothing in particular. His pale skin was smeared with fresh blood and scars that were in the process of healing. His eyes were even more lifeless than ever before. Letting out a tired sigh, Northern gently dropped the mortal blade beside him and plopped to the bed, staring at the broken ceiling. He stared at it for a long time. He couldn't tell what he was looking at, but there was a torn portrait there. It was of a blonde lady with sea-blue eyes. A part of their face was ripped off, but he could tell from the little that was left, the sparkling pieces of jewelry that adorned her features, her radiant smile, and her glamorous dress, that she was undoubtedly a princess or a queen. But what was a princess? What was a queen? Thinking was becoming really hard for Northern. It seemed that he had become a monster for the most part. Even his mannerisms, which were the little bit of sanity he managed to hold on to, looked like they would soon be lost too. In this nightmare, lost and alone, Northern had no one to beckon to, no one to find him. His eyes, which felt very heavy, began to close, and soon he was asleep again. Shrouded in a cold darkness, he heard a distant voice call a strange name. North! North! No matter how much the voice called out, the embrace of the darkness was too overwhelming to break free from. Unable to recognize his own name or his mother's voice, Northern slept peacefully in the comfort offered to him by a serene and ruthless madness. His eyes snapped open as a searing pain lanced through his leg. He jolted upright, eyes widening at the sight of a polearm impaling his right thigh. His gaze traveled up the shaft to the vicious creature gripping it, a familiar terror that was unfamiliar at the same time. For malevolent eyes set in a fur-matted visage burned with cold madness. Tightly coiled muscles rippled beneath the fur, framing the intense, powerful form of a horror Northern knew all too well, albeit long forgotten. His brows furrowed, shadows veiling his expression. This was probably the most emotion he had shown in ages. With a callous glare, the vicious terror wrenched the pole arm free, creating a crimson shower on Northern's bed. As it drove the spear down again, Northern instinctively rolled away, hitting the ground with a pained grunt. He pushed upright, favoring his left leg as agony lanced through the right. Northern's pale, sweat-beaded face hardened as he stared at the terror in tense silence. The cloying scent of his own blood mingled with the chilly breeze fluttering the curtains, filled the chamber with unpleasantness. His sword lay at the creature's feet, leaving him unarmed and too lost to summon a fresh weapon or know that he was meant to summon one. After all, the brutal spirit of war had driven him to utter madness, until he became lost in the darkness of his own soul. The vicious terror closed the distance in a single, fluid step and hurled the spear with frightening speed. Northern's eyes flew wide, but he managed to twist to the side and it got stuck in the wall behind him. He leaped over the bed, rolling to the position the terror had stood moments before. Slowly, Northern bent and retrieved his sword, leveling the blade as his eyes burned with bloodlust. Both vicious creatures forged by the wicked flames of war glared coldly at each other. The terror wrenched his spear out of the wall and suddenly, it looked like it had an evil grin on its horrible face. Northern's brow twitched and his eyes darted to the entrance as another similar creature stomped into his room.